On behalf of the University of Washington Law School, we want to welcome you all. My name is Pat Kusler. I am the faculty director for our Center for Law Science and Global Health. And our other conference sponsors are the End of Life Liberty Project, headed up by Catherine Tucker, who's right over here, and Drug Policy Alliance, which is headed up by Jag Davies, who's here somewhere, up there. And as we look at the day, we cannot forget to mention Terry Price, who's our executive director, who's back there in the corner. Terry and I will be your timekeepers, and Terry is the person who you've probably been communicating with as you registered for the conference, or our conference director, Kathy Klein. A couple of housekeeping things. First of all, for those of you who wish to get on computer and look at the materials online or check your email, we have a wireless connection here, and there's a little thing with all of the passwords up front. So that's available. Be aware that we have some photographers taking pictures of the conference. So if you don't wish to be seen in the picture, just kind of hunker down and don't show your face, because they'll probably be taking some shots of the room. Other logistics, for those of you who are looking for the restrooms, they are that way at the end of the hall. And that, I think, is the basic logistics. And now we have the opportunity to begin this wonderful conference that looks at new frontiers in palliative care, and particularly the use of psychedelic drugs. This is a cutting-edge area of research and an area that has generated much interest on the part of both physicians, particularly those engaged in end-of-life care, lawyers who are interested in the legal issues, and of course ethicists. And we'll have the opportunity to hear from all three experts in all three areas today. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who is going to give us a bit of an overview of the developments in law and medicine around end-of-life care, Catherine Tucker, who is the director of the End of Life Liberty Project and has a long, long history working in at the intersection of law and medicine, particularly in terms of legal issues at the end of life. Catherine.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks so much to everyone for being here so early. I do want to go pretty quickly through my slides because I think in some ways I'm the least interesting of the presenters. I'll be talking about what's happened to empower patients over the last quarter century or so that patients facing end of life due to terminal illness have more choices. And where that brings us to the question of why the emerging science around psychedelic medicine is so interesting. And so my particular interest in this medicine is as it is efficacious in end-of-life care, although some of our other speakers will talk about other applications as well. So one of the great things about modern medicine is that it can extend life, but one of the difficult things is sometimes dying patients find themselves in a dying process that goes on so long that it seems like torture. And this is a quote from one of the sort of leading commentators about what's happening in modern medicine, Atul Gawande, who many of you may have read his book, Being Mortal. He's also the commentator in the New Yorker magazine, and I think he recognizes this reality nicely. What I've seen over the years as a lawyer, and I know many of you here are clinicians, but having heard the stories from patients that I've represented in discussions about why they want more choice at the end of life, these kinds of situations depicted in this slide of what happens when you're dying of ALS or when you're dying of cancer or AIDS or COPD, these deaths can be very long and very brutal. And these excerpts are from an amicus brief that was recently filed in a case I'm involved with in New York. So very difficult deaths sometimes present. Why does it matter that we empower patients who are facing end of life with more choice? I think Ronald Dworkin said it very nicely in these words, and for some people, it's just enormously important that there's some coherence between the life they've lived and the death that they're able to achieve. In modern American medicine, the default seems to always be in the direction of another intervention and more treatment and a drill down into a particular very specific crisis rather than treating the patient as a whole. And what I say when I am addressing lawyers who represent seniors and in the area of elder law is when you're counseling your clients to make sure they know that if they want to avoid that default, they have to plan carefully, and there may need to be advocacy to make sure that default is not imposed on them. There is some good news around empowering patients with more choices at the end of life. And I think really we've seen in the last 25 years a tremendous movement in that direction, which is good. So we all know that every individual can and should think about what their preferences would be for end-of-life care if they were to lose the ability to express them, and have those wishes reflected in documents like an advance directive, and or what now is sort of an improvement on just the patient's expression of wishes, but where those wishes are then transmuted into physicians' orders for end-of-life care, which are referred to as POLST documents. Or MOLST, medical orders for life-sustaining treatment, different terminology depending on the state you're in. Those conversations that patients and doctors have about end-of-life care planning are now compensated, which is good. It's reimbursable, and it makes it more likely that that kind of conversation will happen. There are many choices that patients can make that will change the trajectory to death. So, for example, in all 50 states, patients can either refuse on the front end or accept and later direct the withdrawal of life-prolonging interventions, whatever those might be. So it might be a ventilator, a feeding tube, a cardiac device. Patients can direct the withdrawal of those interventions, even if it's understood that that will precipitate death. And good palliative care is the standard of care to anticipate what kind of suffering might arise. Patients in all 50 states can make the choice to stop taking food and fluid. That has its own acronym, VSED, widely respected in both law and medicine. It is important that the patient that makes that choice gets good palliative care to stay comfortable as possible. Aggressive pain and symptom management is standard of care, and so for patients who have pain and other physical symptoms as they approach death, they should get attentive and responsive care. And I have been involved in cases where the sole claim has been inadequate pain and symptom management, and we now do hold providers who fail to provide that care accountable. And some of you may know the case of Bergman v. Chin, which was a case tried to a jury where the jury found for the plaintiff because the care was so inadequate in addressing end-of-life suffering related to terminal cancer that it was deemed to be reckless, and it was held to be a form of elder abuse. We also, for patients who have pain and other physical suffering that is refractory and not responding to conventional treatment, the intervention known as palliative sedation, although that's its own intervention where the name is often something else. So sometimes you'll see it referred to as terminal sedation, total sedation, or sedation to unconsciousness. That's an intervention where the clinician administers medication so that unconsciousness is induced. The patient has no awareness of physical suffering. Food and fluid are withheld until death arrives. That intervention has been recognized in both law and medicine. Although what you'll see if you take a look at the clinical practice guidelines for this is often the reminder that this is for physical suffering and not for non-physical or existential suffering. And I've given you one statement of that. And another intervention that can change the trajectory to death that has been in the public eye a lot over the last 25 years is the choice for aid in dying, when a mentally competent, terminally ill patient is able to request from their physician a prescription for medication that they could ingest to achieve a peaceful death. That intervention has been somewhat controversial but has become increasingly available. Quick overview of that. Some of you may have been familiar or read as law students the cases of Glucksberg versus Washington and Quill versus New York, a pair of cases that went up through the federal courts seeking to establish that that choice was entitled to recognition as a federal constitutional right as a matter of privacy, liberty, or equal protection. Those cases then, the Glucksberg case on the West Coast and the Quill case on the East Coast were both successful in the federal circuit courts of appeal, with the Ninth Circuit ruling that was a privacy interest and the Second Circuit finding an equal protection interest. The U.S. Supreme Court took both of those cases, heard them in tandem, and said, we're not going to find federal constitutional protection today. We might in future. But in the meantime, we invite the states to address this issue. So it was very much an invocation to the laboratory of the states. Those decisions did respect the choice for palliative sedation, which really kind of opened the door to that intervention being more embraced and accepted. So what happened in the laboratory of the states is Oregon became the first laboratory by adopting through initiative a Death with Dignity, and that's what the Oregon law is called, Death with Dignity Act in 1994. It had been held up with litigation challenging it. That litigation was resolved very shortly after the SCOTUS ruled in the Quill and Glucksberg cases, which opened the way for implementation, which began in 1998 and has continued uninterruptedly since then, and we'll hear from, on the next panel, an Oregon physician who's been involved with provision of care since the beginning of the implementation of that act. As an advocate, one of the most useful things about Oregon's enactment of its statute and its implementation is it does require the collection and reporting of a lot of data. So we now have 20 years of data from Oregon about who chooses aid in dying and why, how it impacts the doctor-patient relationship, and how it galvanizes changes in end-of-life care, which overall have raised the floor for good end-of-life care for all patients. So we see it increasingly available. The Oregon law I've mentioned, Washington followed in 2008, also through a direct democracy initiative process. Vermont was the first state to enact a statute through the traditional legislative process in 2013, California in 2015, Colorado in 2016. So we have seen more states adopt these measures, and there's a continued effort to do that through legislative processes. All of the statutes that have been enacted impose limitations on eligibility. The patients must be mentally competent, they must be terminally ill, and reside in the state where care is being provided. And there are elaborate procedures for how the patient makes the request, how the clinician documents the request, witnessing, waiting periods, collection, reporting of data, permission for clinicians to opt out. So these statutory schemes are elaborate and complex. Some really interesting information comes from the data, and if you aren't familiar with it, I invite you to just Google up Oregon Death with Dignity, and the state maintains a website with very accessible data showing who makes this choice and why. One of the really interesting bits of data that I think surprised many of us is a very considerable fraction of patients who go through that elaborate process and get their prescription don't go on to take the medications. They're comforted to have them, but they go on to die of their underlying disease. We've seen a lot of evidence that the floor is raised for good end-of-life care. Clinicians get busy learning how to treat pain and other symptoms. They take more continuing education to that end. They do more prescribing of strong pain medications, and they increase their referrals to hospice and make those referrals earlier, which is so important. And open and candid communication is facilitated. So we've started to see the emergence of broad support among medical and health policy organizations for this intervention, and these are just a few of the national organizations that have adopted policy supportive of that choice. We also, from the lawyer side, continue to work to expand this particular choice through litigation, and we've moved that litigation primarily into the states. So some of you may know, for example, the case of Baxter versus Montana that went to the Montana Supreme Court in 2009, asserting the right of dying patients in that state to be able to make the choice for aid in dying. Montana, anyone here from Montana? Show of hands. Anyone familiar with the Montana Constitution? Super unusual provision in that it has a dignity clause, the only state constitution to have that. So when we framed that case, we had claims for privacy and dignity, and the lower court, the trial court, found an intertwined privacy dignity right. When the case went to the Montana Supreme Court, that court said, we don't actually need to reach the constitutional issue because we can decide this on statutory grounds. We see that in Montana, the policy environment is to empower patients with broad autonomy over end-of-life decision-making, and therefore there could not be a successful prosecution of a physician who provides aid in dying. So in Montana, since 2009, there's been an open practice of aid in dying without statutory governance. The practice is governed there by the court decision and what governs most medical care, standard of care, or best practices. So that's an interesting forum where aid in dying is practiced. Similar cases have not been successful yet elsewhere, but that's an ongoing sort of advocacy, so stay tuned for that. But I guess what I would say, and I'm coming to the end of my slides, is while a lot has been done to promote improvements in pain and symptom management in the last 25 years, it seems to me as a non-clinician, but as a patient's rights advocate, that these changes and improvements have been largely directed at physical sorts of suffering. So when I started to see the discussion in literature about the amazing findings with the efficacy of psychedelic medicine in relieving non-physical suffering, I sat up and took notice and was excited to be part of this convening and to learn and hear from clinicians, and we'll hear from a number of them today, about how they feel the importance potentially of having additional tools in the palliative care toolbox that can address non-physical suffering. Because we just haven't really seen as much of that as we would like to see. And back on the lawyer advocate side, I can say I'm certainly aware and have observed over the course of my career how important it is to policymakers that there be science, or to many policymakers, certainly not all, but many policymakers do think science is important. And so the research that's coming out, which is so painstaking and so careful, and we'll also hear today from someone who has taken a historical view of what's happened over a long span of time with regard to this kind of research, and it's waxing and waning over time, but this modern rounds of research is so painstaking and careful, and the studies that are coming out are therefore really powerful tools to use in advocacy if and when we get to that point. And I think that's the idea of this symposium, is to start the process of thinking, what would advocacy to make these medicines available look like? So we'll hear some of that today as well. And I think also this is a really interesting question that I hope many of our speakers can comment on, if we allow dying patients to access controlled substances to precipitate death, which we do with a number of interventions, palliative sedation, aid in dying, why would we not offer patients who have anxiety about their death the opportunity to have controlled substances which may ameliorate or eradicate that suffering? Really interesting question, I think. And we have a speaker here, and I've quoted from him. I don't know, Ira, if you knew I had this slide in here, but Ira Byock is one of our speakers on the next panel, and I was very interested. I'm a fan of his work, that he wrote a couple of years ago this statement in the Oxford Handbook on Death and Dying, which says very much what I was alluding to. So to that extent, I think Ira and I are thinking along the same lines, is we should look at this in light of this reality. So hopefully we'll hear more from Ira about that. And then I think this is an interesting question for any of you who are in the research world, which is there are a lot of clinical trials ongoing now, and one of our speakers is enrolling patients in such trials with these psychedelic medicines. Interesting question whether patients who have that opportunity would in any way alter their interest in or desire for aid in dying. Super interesting question. So what kind of advocacy might be engaged? I think that's the point of our joining together today to think about. Could we be reclassifying these substances off of Schedule I where they cannot be prescribed to Schedule II or other? Are there other options that are within the parameters of FDA? And we have a wonderful FDA expert here who'll speak to us about that. Can we look to medical marijuana as a template of any sort for what might be done vis-a-vis psychedelics? And what's happening with cooperative federalism, which we were seeing operate fairly robustly in recent years, with about half the states having medical marijuana available. With a new federal administration, what's the impact on the whole notion of cooperative federalism? So we'll hear from some experts on that as well, which I think should be really interesting. And should advocates be thinking about, well, which states would be favorable if it was deemed timely to begin advocacy to make psychedelic medicines available? Would we look to a state where aid in dying was openly available for some of the reasons I alluded to? Would we look to a state that has the model of medical marijuana? I think these are all really interesting questions. And hopefully we'll talk about that today as well. So in closing, my predictions will be that choices available to dying patients will continue to expand. For example, we'll see aid in dying becoming increasingly available. And I think the palliative toolbox will continue to expand, and possibly with psychedelic medicine becoming a part of that toolbox. So I know we have an aggressive timekeeper in the back. Do we have time for questions, Terry? Okay, I'm happy to take questions, comments from anyone, or very happy to roll into our next panel if there aren't questions. Yeah?
Does Montana collect data?
Montana is not required to collect and report data. No. I mean, there's anecdotal, but not officially collected and reported. Yeah.
In terms of advocacy and education, what kind of attempts are being made to reach out to minority groups? Because minority groups have very little interest, even in hospice, let alone aid and dying. So I'm wondering where that's going.
Right, so the question was outreach to minority populations. Such an interesting question. So if you look at the data that is collected and reported, part of the demographic data relates to that, and you can see what populations are making the choice, and it is overwhelmingly white. It tends to be people of a higher education level and greater affluence, so it is a self-selected fragment of the population. And I think if the question is why is that, people who choose aid in dying seem to be people who've had a lot of control and autonomy across the lifespan, and they want to continue that as they approach death. And for people that have felt marginalized or that healthcare services are not readily accessible to them, their concern is more with wanting additional care rather than less care or being able to precipitate death. So I think it's a really complicated cross-cultural question, and some of our speakers I know have looked at that, and in particular how when you expand end-of-life choice, how does that affect vulnerable populations? So we'll hear from some of the speakers about that later today. Yeah.
You mentioned that the Oregon law studied and has a lot of data that includes changes in doctor-patient relations, said in open and candid communications facilitated. I'm an Oregon doctor and I'm an advocate for the law. I filled out those data forms, sent them into the state, but nothing I ever fill out addresses either of those issues. So I wonder where those assertions are coming from.
Right. So there are studies that have looked at that, and Dr. Gideons, who's on the next panel, may have some particular insight into that. But there is a fair amount of published literature that looks at the question of how, when aid in dying is available, how does that impact the doctor-patient relationship? And it may have been the Senator Wyden GAO inquiry that really drilled down into that. But I'm not recalling it off the top of my head. So hopefully another speaker will, and if not, shoot me an email because I know I have that literature in my Rolodex somewhere. Yes? Is there like a hopeful time frame on when this will be available to people? Psychedelic medicines? Yeah, so Rick Doblin, who's a later speaker today, I think will give us some good insight into that, in the status of the ongoing studies. And then I hope Lynn Mailer, who will be speaking to FDA processes, can also reflect on that a little bit. But I think that's a big question. Yeah.
So I was interested in your prediction that this will spread and liberalize. And thinking about it in the context of our current political environment at the federal level, and also the developments around opioid use and availability. And I just wanted you to reflect a little bit on your prediction in light of those.
Right. So I think that's really interesting. And with the change in the federal administration that happened a year ago, almost, I think that's a really open question. And I've asked some of the speakers to think about and comment on that. So I think we'll hear about that throughout the day. But I know as an observer myself, I feel like there's been some conflicting messages. On the one hand, you see Attorney General Sessions talking about cracking down on medical marijuana and rolling back what I refer to as cooperative federalism. And then yet one of the earliest public pronouncements that the current president of the United States had made was an intention to roll back regulation at the FDA and streamline everything that happens there. So there's a little bit of tension there, and I hope some of the speakers who have insight on that, and I did ask some of them to kind of mull that over and comment on it to the extent that they can. Really interesting question, yet to be seen. Yeah. Yes, so for patients who are not terminally ill, they are not eligible for aid in dying under any of the schemes, whether statutory or judicially achieved, because that has been something of a bright line both in the legislatures and in the courthouse as well. So for patients with non-terminal conditions, they don't have the option of accessing aid in dying. They do have other options, such as I listed, foregoing food and fluid, directing the withdrawal of any life-prolonging intervention, and so forth. So there are choices that those patients can make that can change the trajectory to death, but aid in dying would not be a choice. And then the question was, what about some of the advocates who want those patients to be able to achieve death? And there is a group that will visit these patients and put essentially a gas bag over their head until that patient is made dead. They're a bit operating on the fringe. They've had a lot of legal problems challenging how they conduct themselves, and it all happens a bit underground. I'm aware that it goes on, but it's not where sort of law and policy is moving in this country at this time. I will say, and we have a speaker here from Canada who will speak at lunch, you know, the Canadians recently saw a High Court decision which respects the right of patients who have grievous and irremediable conditions to have a physician assist them in achieving death. The Carter decision, some of you may be familiar with in Canada, but that's not where law and policy have been going here in the States. So, and on that, I should probably roll on. Our time is up. Thank you, Terry, for keeping us on track. Our next panel, very exciting to introduce three really outstanding palliative care physicians in this country who are going to come up and take seats. Tom Strauss will be closest to the podium. Tom came up from UCLA and is a clinician who treats patients. He's a psychiatrist, and his area of interest is psychiatry, particularly in the care of cancer patients. So he will be sharing the perspective of a long and distinguished career in that domain. Sitting next to Tom will be Ira Byock, who also came up from Southern California, but has hopped all around the country with different really distinguished positions as a palliative care expert, and that is his area of focus, widely published and very well known. Very glad to have you today, Dr. Byock. And then on the end will be Nick Gideons, who came up from Oregon and has a long practice in family practice, cradle to grave, and has been one of the clinicians both providing a broad array of end-of-life choice, including the choice for aid in dying under the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, as one of the early providers that was openly willing to do that and educates other physicians about how to do that, and has served as an expert witness from time to time in some of these cases that I alluded to. So I'll invite that panel to come up, and away we go. Thanks.
Very good. I'll just make a couple of comments, picking up on some of Catherine's, and then maybe Ira can show his slides, which might galvanize our discussion. A lot of people regarding physician aid in dying have been really interested in California's experience because California is such a huge and socio-demographically diverse state. And although my comments are hardly scientific, and for those of you who've taken a look at the California Department of Public Health's first posting, which went online a month or two ago, it's pretty unrevealing and considerably narrower in what is reflected than what Oregon has been reporting for years and years. But I can tell you, having been involved in UCLA, so the University of California health systems, of which there are 5, were directed by the president to draft campus-based policies that would engage us in adhering or complying to the California law, which we've done. And I've been involved in that from the beginning and have had a particular role of being one of the small group of mental health professionals who evaluates patients who, to borrow from the language of the law, are thought by their attending or consulting physician to show evidence of a mental disorder, which requires a psychiatric assessment. It's archaic language, but that's what the legislature put into the law. So for what it's worth, I've seen 5 or 6 such patients, which have included, on the question of communities of color and underrepresented groups, an African-American woman and 2 Latina women. That's not science, but maybe it means that California's experience is a little different. on the topic, which is really the middle of the bat, to borrow from a World Series terminology for today's talk, I guess, and that is the role of psychedelics. Certainly, as a psychiatrist, been working in palliative medicine for 25, 30 years, it's clear that some patients suffer mightily in a psychological sense. Some of those patients can and do benefit from what are now evidence-based psychotherapies to address dignity and existential purpose. Many of you will be familiar with the work of Bill Breitbart at Sloan Kettering and Harvey Chachanoff in Canada, who have innovated dignity-based therapy and meaning-centered psychotherapy, not in that order. That is, Harvey Chachanoff is dignity therapy and Bill Breitbart is meaning-centered psychotherapy. Bill's work really derives from the work of Viktor Frankl. But not all patients are game for psychotherapy, and perhaps even equally important, not all places can offer evidence-based trained therapists to provide that psychotherapy. So there's certainly a fair question about a mismatch between the availability of those services and patients' ability to benefit from them. But I mean the other point too, which is not all patients want or would make use of that. So I think the notion that there might be pharmacologic approaches that might reduce death fears or anxiety is very interesting. And as one of our other panelists, our ethicist, boiled it down in our pre-conference discussion, if it's as simple as, could the field of palliative medicine benefit from targeted psychotropics that might in 1 or 2 treatment sessions either for a long time or permanently reduce people's distress about their existential concerns? Yeah, that would be an amazing contribution. Am I persuaded that the data available to us now suggests that that's reliable or reproducible? I am not. I live in Southern California, though, so lots of people have, well, I guess it might be true here, too. Lots of people have access to mushrooms. Some of my patients have done some experimenting. More than that, I cannot say. I haven't seen bad stuff happen. I've seen some patients get significant relief. Charlie Grobe, who is on the faculty with me at UCLA and who is one of the actual investigators, one of the people who studied psilocybin in this setting, isn't here, and he's not here because he doesn't think that the science is ready for prime time. So I'm sure we'll have a conversation about that as well. Anyway, I could say more, but I'm going to stop there because Ira has some slides, and maybe those would be another way of getting us going here. Do you mind?
Not at all.
Okay.
So it's a delight to be here. In one sense, I've been waiting, I don't know, 35 or more years to be here. As somebody who grew up during a time when psychedelics were in the environment, right? I have had experience with them before going to medical school. It's part of why I got clear about what I wanted to do with my life. That's not. It's not something I've said publicly very often, but it's clearly something that those of us of a certain age are aware of. I don't think that these were recreational drugs. They were exploratory drugs. They were very serious drugs from my perspective. I was sitting here. I wasn't actually planning on showing slides, but given the presentation by Catherine, who I've known for years, and Peggy, who I've known for years, and I've been part of the loyal opposition. I disagree with many of the things that they have written, and frankly, several of the things that Catherine has just said. But I wanted to frame what this looks like from a clinical ethics perspective, something that I teach to medical students and write about a lot. From a clinical perspective, there are always 2 moral agents in any clinical encounter, in any clinical relationship. I'll just say the doctor, but I'm not trying to be chauvinistic, any clinical provider and patient. There is a distinction between suicide, which you might say could be a purely personal and private act, and assisted suicide, which in a case of physician-assisted suicide, certainly, well, assisted suicide includes somebody else by definition. Physician-assisted suicide means that that person is licensed and compensated, certified and compensated by society. I'm often quoted or non-quoted, but it's often alleged that I say that with perfect palliative care, people wouldn't want to end their life, and I think I've never said that. I think rational suicide exists. I think that even with perfect palliative care, some people will choose to end their life. As a healthcare professional, I think our responsibility is to do everything we can to make the best of a patient's condition and provide them with the best quality of life possible. The patient must decide whether what we have to offer is sufficient or of value to them, to him or her. I just want to go back, and Tom alluded to this, but I just want you to know that healthcare in America today related to people with serious, incurable illnesses is awful. It's in crisis. That's not just an allegation on my part. That's pretty well established. These are 4 covers of Institute of Medicine reports. And people today at some of the institutions where we practice, where I practice, where Tom practices, Charlie Grob practices, you can get incredibly good care for your cancer, your heart failure, your liver disease, whatever it is, and live longer because of it. But during the last months, weeks, and days of life, you're at high risk of getting really bad care, dying badly, suffering as you die, dying in places you would never have wanted to be had anybody asked you, but of course we don't ask you. We just assume that dying is the worst thing that could happen and do everything possible to keep you alive. We provide hospice, which is kind of the gold standard. I often say, you know, dying at home without hospice care is like having general surgery without anesthesia, right? But under the regulations today, it's not enough to be dying to get hospice care for your comfort and quality of life. You also have to agree you are dying, something that many of my patients never wanted to do, and you have to be willing to forego treatments to keep you alive. Your cancer treatments, your liver failure treatments, in some places getting on a transplant list, those sorts of things. That's not the case with aid in dying or physician hasten death. And in fact, with hospice care, if you get stronger with hospice care, somebody will come and graduate you from hospice care because under Medicare, the hospice program will be at risk. That nobody comes and takes away your lethal prescription, which kind of from a social perspective, a societal perspective, kind of sends a message to some people that you're not dying quickly enough to get hospice care, but you always have an option. Catherine Tucker mentioned this. Just when you look at the data from Oregon, which has some data, it is reported by physicians and the like, so you have to take all of this with some grain of salt. But you notice that the large majority of people are not taking or not seeking the option of hastening their own death because of physical pain or fear of future physical pain. It's non-physical suffering that dominates this. I've written all this in the paper that I wrote for this, by the way, so that's why I'm going fast, and also I didn't actually intend to show slides. My own list of these are the reasons that cause people to choose to hasten their death. These are things that are not restricted to being terminally ill. People with crippling arthritis and macular degeneration or early Parkinson's disease or any number of physical causes or just chronic depression, chronic anxiety, can feel helpless, hopeless, and see their future as bleak. In fact, clinical depression, part of the syndrome of clinical depression is that when you're in the midst of it, it seems like there's no hope, that the future is just black. We know that that's part of the syndrome and it's treatable and will resolve, but, not for the person going through it. So very quickly, I put this in just because this is what I teach medical students, and I wish I had more time to do this, but I teach medical students that there are only 3 major professional boundaries. I mean, you have to be honest and, there's some basic human boundaries, but basically 3 boundaries. Number 1, no personal gain, right? We get well compensated as a doctor. That's got to be enough. You may want that, red Tesla that your patient is never going to drive again, and he may want to give it to you, but that's not really okay, right? It's just not. You may be building a cardiovascular center and you know that he would like to contribute to it. It's not okay to ask about it, right? Here's Doctors Without Boundaries. So could we have all of your stuff after you die. That's ridiculous, right? None of us would say that. We have development offices to say that. 2, no sex. Patient may want to have sex with you. You may feel it. She says, oh, I know you feel it too, doctor. Not okay, right? This is the great Gabriel Byrne in Treatment, the HBO show. He was playing a psychiatrist. His 9 a.m. Monday morning patient falls in love with him, and he crosses the line by reciprocating. As a psychiatrist, he should have seen that attraction in diagnostic terms to tell you about something going on in that relationship, but this is countertransfer. It's to its extreme. It crosses a bound.
He wasn't a psychiatrist. He was a non-physician therapist. I just have to say that in defending my career.
And no killing. Now, I know that it's legal in a number of states now for lethal prescriptions under some circumstances, but it's not medical. They've made it legal. They have not made it medical. From my perspective, as a lifelong political progressive, by the way, this is beyond the bounds of health care. I teach medical students that the proscription against doctors killing patients is not to protect doctors. It's to protect patients from doctors. Because once you start defining something as a reason to kill somebody, boy, it's like giving a 3-year-old a hammer, right? The whole world starts to look like a nail. There's a lot of non-physical suffering. Having said that, a doctor who has never been tempted to kill a patient probably has had limited experience or is not able to empathize with those who suffer. That's why we have professional boundaries to remind us, and that's why we work in teams. That's why I can call up colleagues when I get stuck. I've debated Tim Quill multiple times about, he's a great doc, wonderful guy, he's just simply really wrong on the issue of assisted suicide, but we've come together about the notion of palliative sedation. It is an extreme but totally necessary way of responding when suffering persists in the physical realm. But alleviating suffering is different than eliminating the sufferer. So I didn't come to talk about assisted suicide or death with dignity or whatever physician hastened death. I would only say that, that when suffering persists, it is warranted that we have responses. Tom went over those responses, and those responses should be multifactorial. It should involve a team. They should look at dying as a potential source of enormous suffering, but also understand that the phenomenon of experiencing a sense of well-being, even while knowing that one is dying, is real. That's not woo-woo. That's part of anthropology. You can get it from the biographical literature. I've been writing narratives about it for a number of years. Several of my books have lots of real stories of people who've achieved a sense of well-being despite knowing that they're dying. Having said that, though, we need more tools. And in a circumstance that we find ourselves today, when people are willing to end their life, not sometimes legally under the physician hastened death laws, but also, taking their lives through true suicide, we need other options. And I would submit that while the literature, which I'm pretty familiar with, is not so compelling that we can say that this is absolutely safe and effective and should be made available, I would say that in the current legal situation of right to try laws, which are legitimizing some medications for disease treatment that have only gone through phase 1 clinical trials, which are toxicity trials, that in that realm, and given that the alternative often people see is hastening their own death, that using psilocybin, MDMA under right to try laws seems entirely reasonable. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Thank you, Ira. We are going to shift into a more conversation mode in a minute, and I'm glad to not be put in the position of arguing with you about some of the points here. Obviously, my experience is somewhat different. Having practiced in Oregon and used death with dignity law, having met the last patient, that most recent patient that I'm likely to prescribe to yesterday. But I think we really agree that when you look at the list of reasons people's physicians cite, and it's certainly a very explicit part of my interview about why people would pursue a physician aid in dying or hastening of their death through use of controlled substances for an off-label use or a not specifically researched use. It emphasizes the autonomy, the ability to enjoy activities in life, hallmarks of depression, and anxiety, and these other existential questions about what is a burden on others, what is dignity, and much less often, but still significantly, not so much under or untreated pain, but the fear of untreated pain. All of which seem amenable to all the tools you've talked about that good hospice systems use, but in a very time-sensitive way. So the opportunity to employ agents, which we're beginning to learn more about for very brief psychotherapeutic intervention, seems like a real opportunity that I want us to keep talking about, and I'll bring any other patient stories that are needed. I've said before that it's very difficult to palliate for the loss of autonomy. We can offer lots of supports, and I tell every patient that I meet interested in physician aid in dying that they likely have and likely will get used to things that they never imagined they would get used to. But nonetheless, that's will imply a steady loss of autonomy through the end of their illness. And if there's one thing I remember reading in some of the literature about what happens when people use psychedelics, is that one of the most permanent affecting changes can be people's sort of open-mindedness. If you look at Myers-Briggs-like strata, and I hope we'll hear more about this afternoon. So openness to getting used to things that you never thought you'd get used to accepting the help that before didn't seem coherent, didn't seem consistent, ego-consistent at the time, seems like a great opportunity, and I can think of a number of patients right now where that was a significant issue. So I think we really rely on being able to use the tools we have. The other thing our conversation might get to today, or I want to make sure I say in the opening remarks, is something happens when the medical legal landscape changes, when tools become available, when we go through the hard work of whether it's a judicial or legislative or referendum process on changing what's available. And I think, fortunately, our experience in now nearly 2 decades in Oregon is that our worst fears about slippery slope, about some of the things that Iris had referred to, have at least not been realized in a mass way that is not focused on vulnerable populations, probably just the opposite. Though I have certainly had patients of color and patients who've been socioeconomically marginalized avail themselves, but the data does not imply that it's a cure for uninsured or anything else. And it has probably prompted, and certainly has prompted a really beneficial movement to align and improve hospice care, which I think Oregon statistics on sort of quality of life, hospice care, percentage dying at home, enrollment in hospice, duration in hospice have all improved greatly over the years that we've had the tool available. So with that, I'll finish my introductory remarks and we can get to some of the questions we have here, I think.
I think this is your turn. Yes.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Sunil Agarwal, Palliative Care doc. I have a question about, as we are bringing these two fields together, psychedelic medicine and palliative medicine, hospice and palliative care, what about bringing in some of the other principles that hospice and palliative docs already utilize, which is around healing environments? So hospice houses, for example, are places where we know these environmental principles make a difference. And why I'm bringing this into this discussion is because psychedelics can be produced in natural healing environments as opposed to being synthesized at Purdue University, Dr. Livning's at Purdue University, not Purdue. safe and all that stuff, the technical aspects of it. But in hospice and palliative care, we say, hey, there's horticultural therapy, there's a value to healing environments. Why not have a patient be in an environment where their psilocybin mushrooms are being produced, and they help grow them, they help to nurture them, and then as we do in all our other integrative therapies, they get to consume them in the healing environment of the hospice house. We have a little bit more liberties in this space, from medically speaking, as opposed to just, okay, we're going to prescribe this pill, and that's all it is. So I just wanted to raise that as a question to all of you. I know Dr. Strauss also does work on cannabis. I've seen some of your papers in the field on that, and that's something I've also worked on. And there's a healing value of the cannabis patient to cultivate cannabis. Talk about this being something that they're empowering themselves with. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Of course, it's going to throw a wrench into the legal FDA.
Yes.
So what? So how the dying puts a wrench in it. That's like.
I'll make a couple of comments, which won't be definitive. I could imagine that any hospice operator contemplating this very creative suggestion that you just made, which I actually think is neat, would be terrified of the wrath of the feds and the interruption of federal funds flow, which doesn't mean it should prevent serious consideration, but it's just obviously a practical consideration. The other comment I would make, while I think there is a compelling argument for further study of, and I think Iris said it beautifully, the ways in which psychedelics might help in end of life. I think it's also fair to point out that they perhaps should be available to people, if they're going to be available, much further upstream, like at or around the time of diagnosis, right? Because one of the concerns, or one of the assertions that people make, is it's that terror or that anxiety that sometimes derails people from what could be curative treatment, or treatment that would lead to a sustained remission, and that also seems like a shame.
Very important point. I love your suggestion. I think it's at least equally improbable as legalizing or getting prescriptive authority to prescribe psychedelics because of the money. Psychedelics would be incredibly inexpensive to use in pharmaco-assisted therapy. These days, as many of you know, hospice houses are very hard to build and maintain, and most of the inpatient hospice facilities are under great stress to use their facility only for general inpatient hospice level of care, meaning ongoing uncontrolled symptoms as an alternative to continuous care at home, those sorts of things, and the regulations and the financing make even those environments a very kind of compressed environment. The average lengths of stay are very short. So, we do need, what would be wonderful is to have, and several of us know about these places, hospice houses that are fully endowed and don't need to bill really anybody for anything, where people who don't otherwise have a safe place to be with their family have that environment. But it's the financing is, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but it's just a challenge in America today. Yes.
Well, may I elaborate on that just a moment? I'm a hospice.
Speak loudly, because
I have a hospice, so I understand that concept. And I think the distinction there is very important, because hospice care is basically covered under Medicare and most insurances. And that is the role of the hospice team that comes in to take care of patients. What the problem is, in terms of having a facility, is that board and care, that space that you live in, where you have a bed and food, et cetera, is not covered. That is either privately covered or it is through an endowment. So that most of the facilities, I'm from Utah, we had a great facility in Salt Lake City, it just closed. It cannot sustain itself without a great deal of input from foundations and private money. But that's where the problem is. And yes, there's definitely a need for that.
just notice that we're talking about, as a people, as a society, we don't seem to have enough resources to take care of people well through the end of life, or really it's just a lack of emphasis, priority, commitment. But we're doing other things that are at least ethically questionable.
In Oregon, we're lucky to two comments on your question. In Oregon, we're lucky to have a fairly developed foster care housing system, and I'm also the medical director of a a fairly high acuity skilled nursing facility. And I'm fortunate when my patients begin to receive hospice care in those settings. They are there because of their socioeconomic status being low. I work pretty exclusively with poor patients, but they are extraordinarily fortunate because they are in an environment where at least there's some ability to receive the additional services that previously or in the English model hospice service would provide. Back to your question, though, since confirming that I would actually be speaking with the speakers of this quality at this conference, I've had the chance to ask a couple of patients gently about this area. And in the two patients where I've gently inquired about what other types of amelioration for their, let's say other therapeutic inventions for the amelioration of the symptoms or the most commonly listed, in which they listed for their reason for pursuing a death with dignity prescription. I think my own hesitancy and their quizzical responses had to do with the set and setting question, right? There's a lot I can't say, and I hope to learn later today about what the research is telling us, what the exact therapeutic interventions are, essentially what the setting is and would be like. And it's hard for me immediately to imagine until you take those further steps to envision what you've described. I thank you for putting that out there. I think I practically, for all those reasons, and from my experience in watching how Oregon's death with dignity law progressed, that's a far way to look, but things generally do bend toward the better, and maybe that's something we'll hear about more today.
Ira, this is a question for you. I wonder if you could clarify what appears to be a contradiction in your position. So you started off showing us a slide to the effect that there is a distinction between suicide and assisted suicide. So you might clarify what that is, and that rational suicide exists, right? And at the same time, one of your 3 principles that you teach medical students about doctors' roles is no killing. So the question is, do you see assisted suicide as killing? And if so, what do we make of the original distinction with which you started? Or it looks as though there's a contradiction between the announced principles that you began with and the things you teach medical students.
So we'll have to go back and forth a little bit because I don't understand your question entirely. Okay. But let me notice that we're here to talk about psychedelic medicine.
Right. Okay.
And it seems like I could ask you about the weather and we talk about assisted suicide, Peggy. So I don't quite understand, why we'd have this conversation at the moment, but I do see writing a lethal prescription, writing a prescription with the intention that the patient will use it to end their life as participating actively in causing the patient's death. Yes, I do.
You see that as killing?
I see it, well, sure. So the principle is no killing. Some of the corollaries are no participation in capital punishment. Right? Doctors for 3 millennia or 2.5 millennia stood aside from that. No participation in torture or enhanced interrogation, even if you're being ordered to do so. Right? And so for me, I see writing a lethal prescription as beyond the bounds of medical practice.
So what is the distinction between suicide and assisted suicide? That was on your initial slide. And what about rational suicide? I realize that, although Catherine started us so nicely with this.
Again, we've gone back and forth many times, and I have multiple papers, as do you. I do think you're seeing a fine line between some things, and I think that this is a very bright line, fine or not.
And I'm going to agree with you completely. It is a big deal for me to write that prescription. Right, and if that's the distinction I was making, it's very real. Back up behind you. Are you talking about the psychedelics? Again, I want to keep this conversation about the prospects for psychedelic medicines at the end of life. I will say the example from that is very much somewhat like the first question we asked. There's no doubt that the market will not respond well to our patients in this situation. A drug that I used to prescribe very routinely for early labor, Seconal, less often for sleep, but that costs nothing, now costs $3,000 for a single bottle. There's no doubt that, in my mind, that whether it's MDMA or psilocybin or LSD, that this will have to happen in some other way, or if not, will be hijacked.
So I want to just agree with you and say I worry that Big Pharma will actively oppose this, because if there is brief pharmaco-assisted therapies that can alleviate people's suffering and obviate the need for them to take antidepressants or anxiolytics daily, Big Pharma is not going to like that.
Unless it would persuade them to take lots more chemotherapy, in which case they'd be behind it.
Yeah, but we're talking. I was actually talking about people without concomitant cancers or other diseases. I agree with your point, by the way, that some people will simply forego treatments that may extend their life because they don't feel that life's worth living. They can't see a future of any hope, and we work really hard in a counseling frame to kind of help them reframe that. But I worry about this, and I think I quote in the paper I wrote for this a conversation I had with George Goldsmith of an organization called Compass in the UK, who his insight is that the costs of these medications will really need to be folded into the professional services for the counseling, pharmaco-assisted counseling, because I think pharma is going to hate this.
I want to actually tell a quick story which perhaps will lead us through the woods of assisted suicide and back to psychedelics, or at least that's my intent. So I've had over about 25 years or 30 years of doing this work, I've had 3 patients kill themselves, and they were all the kind of people you would imagine they were looking at the Oregon data. They were all old white guys who were going to have no part of being disabled or passively dependent on anybody. They didn't have mental illness. They wouldn't have accepted any kind of treatments that were behaviorally focused. They were coupled. They were all heterosexual, married to women. They had no concern, at least that they were willing to articulate, about the impact of their violent suicides. They all shot themselves, on their survivors. And I see those as actually the worst possible outcomes for everyone, certainly for their spouses, certainly for their treaters. I can't say a no for them, and all the first responders who were called to the scene. In one case, the gentleman, the PCA that I had been prescribing, the portable pain pump that I'd been prescribing for his not well-controlled pancreatic cancer pain, was running in the public park where he shot himself. So I got the first call from the police. Wouldn't it be amazing if those men, this is just a fantasy, had a single psychedelic experience that might have made a whole different direction possible for them? I think that would have been extraordinary. And I don't, of course, know that it would have happened, but it's just a thought.
But that's, you speak my mind, and we've had somewhat similar experiences in this regard. And, you know, I've written a lot about human development through the end of life, and casting the dying process as a process of successive completions of spheres of oneself, so that they're not ripped from you, but you can actually feel somewhat complete and let them go, so that you're sort of gently dissolving out of life, maintaining a personal integrity. That's part of that sense of well-being. It really is possible, but it's not possible for everyone. And people, the white male who's deep into control, often will not even engage in that level of counseling, just not interested and doesn't want any of it. And having something brief that might shake, you know, what happens in successful counseling is people get a sense of reframing about their life, their relationship to others, their relationship to nature, their relationship to the world and life itself. That's really, it can be done, but it takes time, and it's not everybody's capable of doing it. This, in my experience and the reading that I've done of the literature over the years, is enables that reframing often in a way that is, with good setting and supervision, can be absolutely transformative.
I've been reflecting on why I feel like in not the only documentary practice, but in the rest of my end-of-life care, why I so often see the resources that hospice has available, usually in the form initially of social workers and chaplains, used less than I would expect, given the distress that I'm seeing. My patient yesterday, it was remarkable to me that her end-of-life plan included the participation of a chaplain in such a direct way, because it's not as common as I would have expected. And I think the time is a really big part of it. When people are really, particularly at the stages where I meet them looking at aid in dying, their prognosis is weeks to a very short number of months. The literature has borne this out pretty extensively, that the time frame is fairly short and nothing focuses those needs. And to spend time that could be one of your last visits with a family member or your closest friends, trucking off to the therapist's office or having them come by and take up half your energy for the day, I think it's a very significant barrier, which is what excites me about the possibilities for very brief, very fast, very effective interventions.
Somebody in the back.
Who's picking?
Yeah. You, sir. Yeah. I can hardly hear. I'm sorry. I'm an old guy.
My name's Hayden. I'm visiting from Canada. And I guess I just wanted to reiterate that comment you made earlier about the introduction of psychedelic therapies earlier. Like this discussion about hospice, like at least in our system, to be eligible for hospice care, a person would have to carry a prognosis of 3 months or less. And so I guess I mean, obviously palliative is involved much sooner, but that idea of this being just for hospice patients to me seems far too late. So I guess I just wanted to reiterate that the idea of making these medicines available much sooner in the illness trajectory.
My 27-year-old son would say they should be available to everyone in their 20s just as a way of preparing for adulthood.
Oh, and given the rising suicide rate among people in their 20s, the question from a public health perspective is, what exactly are we worried about? What really are we worried about? These are non-addictive in general. They do not have tissue toxicity. They are not intoxicants in the usual sense of that word. They don't make you sleepy. They obviously for the 6 or 8 hours that you're affected by it, you shouldn't be operating machinery or any of that. But these are not drugs of abuse in the usual sense of the word. So I'm not quite sure I get the politics, but from a pure public health perspective, I'm not quite sure what the resistance is. Let me get somebody back up there. Yes, you. Yes.
Hi,
Sorry.
I'm a hospice nurse in California, and we just had our first few patients using the end-of-life treatment. And I'm wondering if we were promoting the use of psychedelic medicine, we would actually end up seeing a decrease in the amount of patients choosing the end-of-life option, because we know that with psychedelic medicine, it decreases the fear of death for people. It actually, from what I've read, that has been the experience.
We should acknowledge that it doesn't decrease the fear of death in everyone. Depending on which studies you look at, it's perhaps 50 to 60% of people. So that's better than antidepressants in the first trial, but it's not perfect. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
One of my one of the opportunities that I'm excited about bringing this group together in this meeting today is we do have some pretty definable outcomes around that, right? Time of prescribing to use of that prescribing, the degree to which people's comfort is achieved simply by leaving the medicine on the shelf, which is not small.
Are you talking about the lethal prescriptions?
Yes. I think the opportunity for looking at the potential of fairly easily measurable interventions, offering it to patients who are seeking end-of-life prescriptions, and then measuring very simple outcomes like, do they not take it? Does it stay on the shelf? Because there is certainly that therapeutic value of knowing that control is there and available. Something like 30% of patients do not need to take the medicine despite having gone through all these steps, despite having spent $1,000 to $3,000 on the medication maybe. So time to taking or not taking, as well as fairly structured questions around the at least better documented in Oregon reasons. I think that's one of the real opportunities here is a really defined population with really defined outcomes.
Do you have any anecdotal examples?
I do not recall. I have not had the experience of some of my end-of-life patients, death with dignity, or not using psychedelic therapy, so I can't say that I have.
Me neither.
Me neither.
I just let me put in another patient population here. There's a number of people, I would say in the 20, maybe more % range, who do not make a distinction between physician-hastened death and hospice and palliative care. It's all kind of mixed together in their mind. It's something about that. And those of us who have practiced hospice and palliative care not uncommonly hear about or meet patients who don't want us because they're not in favor of that Kevorkian stuff, and and so that conflation really does effectively diminish access to palliative care and hospice care. And again, I think this option might be a way to draw people in, whether it's done in a palliative care framework or through a psychiatric or other counseling framework. That may be a way to touch people who are already worried about us.
I just need to augment Ira's comment by saying I work almost exclusively in cancer, and I still work with medical oncologists who are certain that the minute my palliative care team walks into the case, that we are engaged in shortening the patient's survival.
No, all the evidence is otherwise.
Which is not true.
We are extending their survival.
It's just not true.
But that adds the measure of time from first recommendation for palliative care to acceptance of palliative care.
Yes, you've been very patient. Ultimately, serious illness is like a hot wind that strips away everything that you think, all the trappings of life, all your roles, your responsibilities, the stuff that fills your Outlook calendars, and you're left with essential questions, right? Who am I now? What's my relationship to the world? What is life after all? Where do I go next? So all of these are, today we would say these are sort of philosophical or existential or spiritual questions. They become very tangible when you can't get out of bed, you can't wipe your own butt. When the stuff that has given your life meaning and enjoyment is no longer available, and you're starting to actually feel like a burden. All that becomes spiritual in a bad way. Let me also say, though, that some people, even without psychedelics, are able to achieve a sense of connection to something larger than themselves, either God or nature, their family, who will live on for generations to come, that provides them with a sense of spiritual well-being during this time. My hope is, in fact, that psychedelic medications will allow that reframing so that people, the stuff that falls away, allows the person going through it to see more clearly the stuff that really endures, the essential meaning. And so whether it's with chaplains or spiritual support counselors or just people who are trained to do this work, I think that's part of the hope.
Catherine didn't mention the introduction, but I'm board certified in addiction medicine as well, and spend a lot of time with patients having serious use disorders with drugs other than psychedelics, because I don't know anyone who has many of those daily use and sacrificing and consequences that define substance abuse disorders. And because of that, I spend a lot of time with folks to which degree in traditional treatment or more modern medication-assisted treatments are invoking 12 steps and others, and to what degree does the spiritual dimension reflect or deflect people from that. And I would only say that tremendous opportunity and tremendous caution, because you really need a very slow and often very long and iterative, like years, process for people to get to a place where they even know where they are about that. So I just say that I think the opportunities are tremendous, but it would take a lot of discernment and care around that.
This gentleman's been very patient.
I think we're talking directly from the overground position, and we're talking directly from the validation position in terms of medicine from what we already know. Many, many people are going to the underground at end of life or who have terminal illnesses for psychedelic psychotherapy, for psychedelic experiences. That goes all the way back to before drugs were legalized. And that knowledge, you know, we have the apocryphal story of Aldous Huxley, which has infused many of us in our culture with the sense of, I want to leave in that kind of glow. I want to have that experience to go out. And so we're kind of in a recovery phase where we're validating on the overground that which we've had 40, 50 years of experience, and many of us know from our personal lives, and that's why we're in this game, because we want to show it, because we know it works, it's good, not for everyone, but for most people. So I'd like to balance the conversation a little bit with that.
I would just say, I think, well-made point, and that certainly also applies to cannabis. You know, I'm frequently treated like a pariah when I give talks to physicians about the, you know, emerging and fairly robust evidence for cannabinoids in symptom management in cancer, particularly for neuropathic pain. And everybody knows about nausea. They may not be any better than the prescription medicines, but they're there. But, you know, just to assert that is to the what you referred to as the conventional culture, or the above ground, the overground, is heresy.
Yeah, I think Puritanism is alive and well in our country, and you know, we can give you medication to suppress your suffering, but heaven forbid we give you medication that actually makes you feel well. That's, you know, that's edgy.
Two comments I'd like to make about that. First, we had a little brief discussion before we started today about how the big swing and how opiates are perceived for pain management. This is an area, and again, I'm perfectly aware of the downsides of Purdue-influenced opiates for everybody prescribing, and now how that is coming back to harm the patients we're talking about here. In a very general way, just as pendulums swing in big non-discriminatory ways and threaten to make, even if our access to the prescriptions themselves aren't available, the patients themselves have a resistance that I hadn't heard about for a long time about, will I become addicted? In that situation, we need to be very careful about that above and underground. And then the, as you really point out, the way, you know, our conversations are really limited about what we can say about our own personal experiences, except maybe before medical school.
I don't know. How about, well, this gentleman with your hat on, nice hat.
My question is for Dr. Strauss. You mentioned fear and anxiety. So the metrics that you use to weigh patient responses will be very different than weighing their physical responses. As I move through my life, the metrics that I focus on are going to change drastically along that continuum. After a rotator cuff surgery, all I'm interested in is range of motion. At the end of my life, I know what the physical result is going to be. It's terminal. All I care about are your metrics. So I'm curious.
Sorry, say again, all I care about?
All I care about are fear, anxiety, inner feelings, and I'm wondering how you measure those metrics and how psychedelic medicines would inform those metrics, and if those metrics are still evolving, and how you see the shift between the metrics of physical symptoms and the shift that are at the end of our lives towards mental metrics.
So I don't mean to be concrete, but you use the word metrics a bunch of times, and are you asking about or suggesting like a rating scale? Is that really what you're asking about?
For those of us that aren't in the medical field, when I go to a physician and measure my range of motion, that's a concrete
Yes,
we have.
right.
I'm wondering how you deal with that.
Well, so there are, you know, depression and anxiety rating scales that are routinely used in clinical care. There are spiritual rating scales. I don't know that there is a specific death, anxiety, and terminal illness rating scale. Maybe there should be. There are some interesting scales that I've just started to learn about from the 60s and 70s, the first decades of study of hallucinogens, which actually I have, well, I don't, it's in a file, which are quite interesting, but I guess I don't have a very good answer for your question. Maybe that's the short version.
So there are quality of life scales that are also imperfect, but get to some of this. I'm not trying to promote this, but I created one many years ago called the Missoula Vitas Quality of Life Scale. It's still available on, I have a website called, just my first and last name, irabayak.org, and it's called the MV Quali. And it would give you, I was just mentioning it to give you a sense that these highly subjective and internal milieu kind of questions actually can be assessed in ways that are reproducible and meaningful. That scale is, again, it's kind of a first generation of quality of life tools, but it is being used in a number of places, and just as an illustration of the availability to measure these things in meaningful ways.
Yeah, I've been very impressed. One of my colleagues in the audience gave me just a very brief overview last night of some of the work around the latest psychedelic research, and it's impressive how those tools are. And one of the advantages that my lay reading, I really look forward to hearing more about it at 11 o'clock, for example. And one of the advantages to a longer measure of scales is that they kind of compound a number of different experiences down to some fairly concrete ratings. And I assure you that I think this is very studyable.
Go ahead. Not this lady over here. Hello. We've ignored this side of the room.
So I'm really interested in this idea that I haven't thought about before, so thank you, of providing psychedelic treatment at the time of diagnosis. And what I'm interested in is the potential impact over total cost of care for individuals who might be given a life-threatening diagnosis. I'm interested in this way, that there's a potential, it sounds like there could be a potential, if the patient is at choice and wants, because of psychedelic treatment, decides to move more cooperatively and quickly through available treatment, or to forego treatment, and that's their choice. There's potential impact to the efficacy of available treatment, and therefore cost of care. And then, of course, on the other side of the coin, if they forego treatment, there's savings there. And why I bring this up is because I agree with you that there are going to be formidable obstacles to overcome, financial obstacles to overcome. And one of the ways I think to think about that is to appeal to the payers of care regarding the total cost of care that psychedelics could have if they're provided earlier on towards diagnosis. So here's my question. I have three. What do you see being the potential impact to the efficacy of treatment if patients are given psychedelic therapy at the time of diagnosis? That's one. Number two, what would you think the criteria would be for identifying patients who have access to psychedelic therapy when they're diagnosed? And lastly, what, if anything, do you think we should be thinking about in terms of measuring total cost of care as we move, hopefully, towards more and more research and even anecdotally, people having access to these treatments, maybe even through the underground and taking record of that?
I'll be really fast. The first question, don't know. The third question, don't know. The second question, who would be given access? It's fairly standard, at least in cancer treatment settings, for us to screen people for distress pretty much every time we see them when they come into the cancer center. So I would guess that the question of to whom would psychedelics be offered, it would be to people who are highly distressed, not to everybody. Now, maybe that's biased and wrong, but that's my first reaction. And I would imagine then there would be a group of people, let's just assume among those who accepted that opportunity, who would either get clarity that they did want to proceed with treatment, or as you suggested, would get clarity that they didn't. So I don't know how you model the economic impacts, but that's the best I can do.
I think the economic impacts would probably be a positive money saved in severe treatment-resistant depression. which people are taking multiple medications for long periods of time with lots of side effects, and the payers would probably like a short session therapy that would maybe obviate or diminish those. I don't know I know it's a studyable question, the impact on people with serious illness. I mean, they may get clear and pursue aggressive, intensive treatments to prolong life. I mean, life is precious, and yet we're all going to be dead a long time. So people legitimately want to stay here, and treatment for late-stage disease is getting ever better. There's really not a bright line between, treatment for your cancer, your heart failure, and futile care anymore. And frankly, from my perspective as a doc, that's a really good thing. It makes decision-making harder, but that's just part of what we need to do. But so I really don't know what the result is going to be. If somebody who doesn't see their life as worth living has a experience of pharmaco-assisted therapy with psychedelics and has new meaning and hope in life, they may pursue treatments that are quite intensive and very, very expensive. And I'm still going to be voting that that's a really good thing. But if they get clear about planning, at least maybe they won't spend the last 3 weeks in an ICU in Sensate when they didn't want to be there. So there's a lot of variables. We can reasonably easily measure costs of care across a trajectory of illness from diagnosis to death. That technology is pretty routine.
Two things I want to share from Oregon's experience very quickly. One, it's clear that physician aid in dying really doesn't change total cost, because we're talking about at the very end when people are on hospice in a relatively short period of time. That's been studied fairly well. Unfortunately, is not really what that's about. Second of all, Oregon's been fairly far ahead in the ACO formation, total cost of care, and one of the great things I've seen from that is a much better integration of early palliative consultation in patients with heart failure and cancer in particular, and the idea that these can be intermingled well for goals, because it's a shared goals that the total experience and the total cost of care all improve. So I can be somewhat optimistic, but this is not about saving money per se. It's going to branch both ways.
Okay, thank you very much. As Professor Kusler said at the beginning of the program, I am Terry Price. I'm the Executive Director of the Health Law Program. I am not Catherine Tucker. You've already met her. So now we're going to have a 15-minute break, and you will see me during the day. My job will be timekeeper to the second, because as you can see, we have a very packed agenda. So for those you who saw, there's coffee and breakfast items out there in the hallway. The bathrooms are on the other side of the registration tables, and we will be back here in 15 minutes to start with the next panel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jag Davies. I'm the Director of Communication Strategy at the Drug Policy Alliance. We're the nation's leading organization working to promote and implement drug policies grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. It is my honor to introduce the next two speakers here. Probably no one has done more than Rick Doblin to initiate and spearhead the renaissance in psychedelic research that you all have heard about. I actually had a very unusual career path and started out my career a dozen years ago working with Rick, and have since gone on to work on drug policy reform more broadly. And Rick is joined by a really brilliant sociologist, journalist, professor, cultural historian, Don Lattin, author of the Harvard Psychedelic Club, and several other relevant works. And I'll just go ahead and hand it over to them. But first, I'm going to make one quick announcement, is that for the questions going forward, we're going to ask folks to line up at the microphones here just to make sure everyone can hear the questions, and so that it gets into the audio recording that's being made of today's symposium. Thank you so much.
How about that? Okay, there we go. Okay. Great. Well, thank you all for coming back from the break on time. I'm really honored to be sharing this time with Rick. We've been crossing paths at conferences for a few years now, and it's always fun to sit with you and talk to you. You know, when I heard that my job was to give the history of psychedelic research, the psychedelic movement in 15, 20 minutes, I couldn't resist the temptation of starting with this slide, which I just found at the, it's the History of Psychedelic Movement cartoon and coloring book. It's a relic of the 60s. It's very rare. Rick had never seen it before. That's how rare it is. And it stars Timothy Leary and two of his colleagues at Harvard before they were beginning their experiments. It says LSD. They were experimenting with psilocybin, but we'll give that's okay. So before I go to the next slide, there's a before and after picture here. How many of you have never heard of Timothy Leary? And don't be embarrassed. How many of you have never heard of Timothy Leary? How many of you know just a little tiny bit about Timothy Leary? How many of you know quite a bit about Timothy Leary? Okay, good, good. You never know with younger audiences. So this is the before, on the back cover is the after picture after their experiments. So you've got before and after. Okay, anyone who knows Leary knows that he never really threw down the martini glass. That was his drug of choice for a long time. But this was about, these two slides were about halfway through what I call the first wave of psychedelic research. And the more serious clinical trials we're talking about now, including using psilocybin and MDMA for therapy, for mood disorders, and for patients with a life-threatening diagnosis, that's part of what I call the second wave of research into the beneficial medical uses of psychedelic drugs. In the United States, the first wave of psychedelic drug research, some of it secretly funded by the CIA and the US Army, began in Boston in 1949, which was just 6 years after the chemist Albert Hofmann accidentally discovered the powerful effects of a drug he labeled LSD-25 at his laboratory in Switzerland. This is Hofmann. Over the next 25 years, more than 1,000 research papers were written about LSD, psilocybin, and psychedelic drugs. There were some 40,000 research subjects who were given these mind-expanding agents, 40,000, and great progress was made in understanding how they might help people suffering from depression, alcoholism, and the psycho-spiritual distress that comes from a life-threatening diagnosis. Theologians and psychologists studied how psychedelics could inspire creativity and evoke life-changing mystical experiences in healthy volunteers. But by 1963, the psychedelic genie was out of the bottle, having escaped the carefully controlled domain of the researcher's laboratory and the psychotherapist's office. Millions of baby boomers, myself included, were coming of age and starting to experiment on their own with LSD, magic mushrooms, peyote, and other hallucinogens. On the East Coast, a charismatic Harvard University psychologist, the aforementioned Timothy Leary, reinvented himself as the high priest of the psychedelic counterculture. This is Leary on the right with his colleague, his main colleague, Richard Alpert, who would later go to India and return as Ram Dass, a spiritual teacher. This is probably around 1961. I love these before and after pictures. This is what a difference a decade makes. This is Richard Alpert in the beginning of the 60s, and this is Richard Alpert as Ram Dass at the end of the 60s. This is Leary after his psychedelic transformation. This is actually at the Human Be-In in Golden Gate Park in my own San Francisco in the January of 1967, where Leary uttered his soon-to-be infamous slogan, "Turn on, tune in, drop out." It wasn't the first time he said it, but it was the first time he got a lot of media coverage for saying it. And that's something that he was very good at, is getting media coverage. And as a reporter, I appreciate that. So around this same time, there was in California, a promising novelist named Ken Kesey gathered a diocesan troupe of merry pranksters and put on a series of huge parties called acid tests, where revelers dosed themselves with LSD and danced to a new band called the Grateful Dead. You can see from this is the Trips Festival, which followed the acid tests. They were so stoned they didn't even know what year it was. 1960 ? Well, it was 1966. Here's a picture of the acid tests earlier on. This was during one of the acid tests, probably 65. This is what was going on the West Coast. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, it looked like that. San Francisco, Harvard. This is Richard Alpert. This is Ralph Metzner with a hole in his shoe, hooked up to something they called the experiential typewriter. He was on DMT, which is a very powerful psychedelic, short-acting psychedelic drug, and writing down his impressions with this typewriter, and there's the future Ram Dass monitoring it. Oops, wrong way. Here's another acid test picture. That's Ken Kesey, the bald guy. So this is kind of sets the stage for when the backlash began soon after all these antics. And the conventional wisdom in some psychedelic circles is that it was the antics of Leary and Ken Kesey and all those wild and crazy hippies in the 60s that sparked this backlash against serious research into psychedelic drugs. And my message to you this morning is it's not that simple. So my reporting and research into the story of psychedelics in the second half of the 20th century are contained in 3 books I've published over the last decade, starting with this one, The Harvard Psychedelic Club, How Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Houston Smith, and Andrew Wild Killed the 50s and Ushered in a New Age for America. Now, Leary and Alpert were kicked out of Harvard in a psychedelic drug scandal in the spring of 1963. And Leary spent most of his 3 years, he was actually at Harvard less than 3 years. He was never a professor on tenure track there. He was a contracted psychologist. He spent 3 years getting high and collecting reports from other people getting high. That's the main thing that they did at Harvard, just to tell you the truth. And his Harvard psilocybin project, they did do some rather spotty, as Rick will tell you, research attempting to see if they could reduce recidivism rates among convicts with psilocybin therapy. And there was a lot of problems with the claims of success that he had there, and Rick has studied that in detail. But it's important to remember that the first wave of government-assisted psychedelic research started 14 years before Timothy Leary was at Harvard, and it continued for 14 years after. And people kind of forget that. So in the early 60s, before the Harvard scandal, government regulators had tightened rules governing academic and medical research into new drugs involving human subjects, not just psychedelic drugs, all drugs. And this was partly due to much needed reforms about safety of human research subjects involving a scandal that involved thousands of birth defects from the drug thalidomide. This happened about the same time as psychedelics were coming, and psychedelics got kind of wrapped up with that as being another dangerous drug, where they were nearly as dangerous as some of these other compounds that they were doing research with. Researchers who were studying this stuff knew by the 1960s that if you were responsible and were careful, you could really help people with these drugs, and you could at least safely study these drugs. But LSD was outlawed for recreational use in 1966. And 4 years later, a federal law ignored the findings of research scientists and declared LSD to be, and psilocybin to be medically useless and easy to abuse, which made new university and medical studies very difficult, but not impossible. Because in the late 1960s, government-approved and government-funded psychedelic research actually expanded at the Spring Grove State Hospital in Maryland. And among the noted researchers working there were Walter Pahnke, who was the principal investigator in the so-called Good Friday experiment in the spring of 1962, a famous study of psilocybin and mysticism among students at a Harvard-affiliated seminary. And Timothy Leary was actually Pahnke's faculty advisor on that experiment, but fortunately, Pahnke didn't follow much of Leary's advice in terms of how the study should be designed. Pahnke believed in a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. He didn't think he had to trip with his students and his research subjects, which Leary did. And he had serious reasons for saying that, by the way. It wasn't just a party. But, and also working with Pahnke at Spring Grove in Baltimore was the Czech researcher Stanislav Grof, who had done work in Czechoslovakia before that, and the Baltimore therapist William Richards, who is still active and one of the few researchers that really did work in both the first wave and second wave of research. Richards' work with alcoholics and cancer patients at Spring Grove and at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Institute would continue until 1977. That was really the end of the government-supported research. And that was when the anti-drug hysteria and rising political conservative were conspiring to shut all this down. Now, the same year, 1977, I was a 23-year-old cub reporter in San Francisco, and one of my first major stories, the lead story in the combined Chronicle-Examiner Sunday paper of October 9th, 1977, was headlined, "The Horror of the Army's LSD Tests." And when I looked up this story, I realized that I've been writing about this stuff for 40 years, which kind of shocked me. Both the sinister and beneficial effects of this research. This story was about a U.S. Army private who was falsely accused of being a spy and basically tortured on LSD, hostile interrogation. And this was all part of research to see if they could basically use LSD as a truth serum or psychologically terrorizing people to get information out of them. That soldier later won a huge damage suit against the government after this story was written, and was on the 60 Minutes, CBS show 60 Minutes. And this is another reason why psychedelic research was shut down in the 70s. The stories of all this inhumane abuse at the hands of our government was starting to come out around the time I wrote this story in the 70s. It was the post-Watergate era, and a lot of this stuff about what the government had been up to was coming out in the press. And another reason that there was this crackdown on LSD, mushrooms, and other psychoactive drugs in the 60s, both in the laboratory and on the street, was because it was basically, I think it was political. One of Richard Nixon's cronies actually said this, confessed that this was really in some ways a political attack on the counterculture, the anti-war movement, and the civil rights movement. This is a quote from John Ehrlichman, you may remember, the older folks here, one of Nixon's top aides. Looking back years later, he said, quote, "We understood that we couldn't make it illegal to be young or poor or black in the United States, but we could criminalize their common pleasure," close quote. That's from Nixon's top aide. So what is it about the nature of marijuana and psychedelics, as opposed to more addictive and deadly drugs like heroin or methamphetamine or cocaine, that the government finds so dangerous? I mean, I think it's increasingly hard to argue that the reason these compounds are outlawed is because they are without medical value and easy to abuse. What is so threatening, in my opinion, to the powers that be about psychedelic plants and drugs are the ideas and the insights that they inspire. In the counterculture of the 60s, that compelled many of us to question the consumerism and materialism that was really the foundation of our economy in some ways. So it's important to note that our understanding of how the psychedelic experience can help us understand death and dying, which is what we're talking about here, does not just come from research in universities and medical centers and therapists' offices. I tell this other story in the second book in my psychedelic trilogy, which is titled Distilled Spirits, Getting High Then Sober, with a famous writer, a forgotten philosopher, and a hopeless drunk. And this is another group biography, like Harvard Psychedelic Club, looking at three men who helped lay the groundwork for the psychedelic 60s, starting back in the 1930s. The writer Aldous Huxley, pictured here, the mostly forgotten Anglo-Irish writer and mystic Gerald Heard, who was kind of a Timothy Leary before Timothy Leary, and Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Some people don't know that Bill Wilson experimented a lot with LSD in the 50s, thinking it could help alcoholics have the spiritual awakening that they talk about in the 12-step movement. I have some new information about that in this book. It's a story that AA doesn't really like to talk about, but it's a part of their history. If you go to my website, you can find some amazing footage from a 1956 CBS News show, Focus on Sanity, which devoted an entire program to LSD research in the 50s. My favorite part, there's an interview with a woman before and during her LSD trip. I call her June Cleaver on acid because she looks like the Leave It to Beaver's 50s housewife who becomes Grace Slick once she drinks this stuff, long before Grace Slick was known. But there's another segment on that show where the Los Angeles researcher named Sidney Cohen asks Gerald Heard to describe the LSD experience, and I thought this was a good quote for this conference. Heard replied, "It's what death will be like, and oh, what fun it will be." "What do you mean?" a puzzled Cohen replied. "Well," Gerald Heard said, "you notice that there aren't these separations that we normally feel. We're not on some separate island, shouting across and trying to hear what each other are saying. Suddenly you know empathy. It's flowing underneath us. We are parts of a common continent that meets under the water, and with that comes such delight, the sober certainty of waking bliss." Close quote. That was Hurd's description of the LSD experience. Now, Hurd was a lifelong friend of the writer Aldous Huxley, who is most famous for, among other things, having himself injected with LSD moments before his death in Los Angeles, which happened to be on November 22nd, 1963, same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. That's why people never saw Huxley's obit when he died. Huxley was suffering from cancer at the time and was on his deathbed. And he'd recently published his final novel, Island, which envisions a time and a place when shamanic therapists could help the deaf and the dying meet their maker with mind-expanding medicine. Gerald Hurd founded a short-lived retreat center in Southern California in the late 30s called Trabuco College, which was the inspiration for the founding of Esalen Institute. And am I getting low on time? So? You are. I am, okay, all right. Anyway, just in conclusion, Leary inspired millions of us to experiment with these drugs, and he did so in a lot of ways, including inspiring John Lennon to write a song about it, Tomorrow Never Knows, which is based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And well, I thought I had 20 minutes, so that was the, did I take 20 minutes? That was 20. Wow. Okay. Well, enough history. The man who's really is responsible for what's going on now with psychedelic research is Rick Doblin. He's done a lot of work with MDA and research. So take it away, Rick. I'm sorry.
Great. Well, I've been feeling like I'm a counterculture drug-using criminal trying to go legit. And I feel like we're making that transition. And it's good that your last slide was the Beatles. There was an article in the Boston Globe on 2 weeks ago Sunday, and the title of it was one of the most clever headlines I've seen in a long time. It was Lucy in the Sky with Doctors. So I'm going to briefly give you a little bit of overview where we're at, but for the purposes of just orienting you, right now there is a renaissance in psychedelic research. There's more going on than at any time in the last 50 years. For depression, we have ketamine, ayahuasca, and psilocybin. Psilocybin is going to be moving into phase 3 for depression. Not just palliative care related, cancer-related depression, but depression in general. As I said, there's work with psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD for end-of-life distress. We were able, there is no such diagnosis, end-of-life distress, according to the FDA. It has to be anxiety or depression. The first way that we were able to start LSD research was with people with life-threatening illnesses, because people have compassion for that group of people. Also PTSD, there's studies our primary focus is MDMA for PTSD, but there's also been some investigations of ayahuasca in non-clinical settings. Substance abuse, psychedelics are pretty powerful. As Don just talked to you about, Bill W. had belladonna, helped him go sober, and then LSD kept him sober. And he found it very effective, but there's research with ibogaine for opiate addiction. It's one of the most important tools that you think a rational society in the midst of an opiate overdose death crisis would be funding research with ibogaine. Instead, we have the National Institute on Drug Abuse donating $6.5 million to a for-profit company to develop a non-psychedelic ibogaine, 18-MC, which is not nearly likely to be as effective. Also psilocybin for nicotine addiction, for alcoholism, and there's a study starting soon in Bristol, MDMA for alcoholism. And psilocybin for obsessive compulsive disorder, and social anxiety, MDMA. And this is only the clinical applications. There's an enormous amount of research now going on with psychedelic neuroscience and also psychedelic spirituality, psychedelics with lifelong meditators. But we're making MDMA into a medicine. On November 29th, 2016, we had what's called an end of phase 2 meeting with FDA. And that's where you review the phase 2 data that you've gathered and you negotiate with FDA whether you're ready to enter the pivotal phase 3 studies. And FDA said yes, that we were ready to do that. And then what we did was very important. They have what's called a special protocol assessment process. It's an option for pharmaceutical companies. So in a sense, in its essence, MAPS is a nonprofit psychedelic pharmaceutical company focused on psychedelics and marijuana. And so this special protocol assessment process, not all pharmaceutical companies avail themselves of it because it delays things a lot, but you negotiate the methodology. And if it's complicated methodology, it's really important to do. So we spent 6 months negotiating with FDA on every aspect of the phase 3 trials, and we received what's called an agreement letter on the 28th of July. That really gives us the confidence that the results will be evaluated on the basis of statistical significance and safety. There will not be critiques of the methodology at the new drug application stage. More publicly, we received breakthrough therapy designation on August 15th. And so this is the most important program that the FDA has for developing the most promising drugs. About 1/3 of the applicants receive breakthrough therapy designation, and most of those that receive it turn into medicines. So this was tremendous. It's such a public statement for FDA to do breakthrough. You know, it's more important, I think, that we got the special protocol assessment agreement letter, but it's more public breakthrough therapy. And so this was really the test for us of FDA. Are they willing to follow the science? Are they willing to do it in a way that the drug czar's office, the DEA, FDA, NIDA, everybody knows about it? And so the fact that they were willing to do this, to me, just is further evidence that the FDA really is science over politics. So we're talking about phase 3 sites. We'll have 16 sites in Israel, Canada, and the United States. And this is where all these sites are going to be. It's important for us to demonstrate that multiple different co-therapy teams, it's a male-female co-therapy team, can do this. It's not concentrated in just a few sites with highly motivated people who did drugs when they were, you know, younger and now, you know, spent their lives wanting to do this work. We're demonstrating, or we anticipate demonstrating, that this is something that can be taught to therapists, that people who've never done psychedelics before can learn how to do this. We do have FDA approval for a protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And that was another big sign for me that the FDA was really willing to take us seriously. Now, this is our basic design for phase 3. In the special protocol assessment, one of the biggest methodological challenges is how do you do a successful double-blind study with psychedelics? And I thought I had solved the problem in my dissertation at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and it was all about using low doses of the test drug, and you increase the blinding that way. And the challenge was to find low doses that didn't have that much therapeutic efficacy, but enough to confuse the therapists and the patients, and then that would be your successful double-blind. And when we had the end of phase 2 meeting, I opened up the meeting with FDA by saying one of my favorite quotes was from a prior president of Harvard, and he said, "Never forget, there's always a Harvard man on the wrong side of every issue." And I said, in this case, it was me. I thought I had the double-blind problem solved, but I didn't, in the sense that low doses of MDMA produce anxiety. They activate people, but they don't reduce the fear enough, so that they actually reduce the effect of the therapy. So I said you could have blinding, but you're going to make it easier for us to show a difference between the full dose group and the low dose group. And it's more important really to show that why add a drug? If the therapy can do it, why, or can do almost all of it, why add a drug with the risks of the drug? And so we proposed an inactive placebo, and FDA accepted it. So it's basically 12 90-minute sessions, 3 for preparation, 3 for integration after each MDMA session, or inactive placebo. They're a month apart, more or less, and then the 2-month follow-up is the primary outcome measure. So that's the protocol design. Timeline, I'll just say that we're anticipating right now, we're a little bit lower, delayed a tiny bit, but in fall of 2018, it's actually starting in December, we're going to be discussing expanded access with FDA. And we are now starting the studies. The final stage of training therapists is that we're having an open label study where each new co-therapy team gets one patient to work with MDMA. So they have experience with one patient, and then we move into the double-blind phase 3 study starting around May of 2018, and we anticipate 2021 that we'll have the drug approved. We're also starting to negotiate with the European Medicines Agency, and it's unclear to us at this moment if they will accept all of the data from FDA or if they will want additional phase 3 studies. They might want a study comparing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy with the best available alternative treatment, because a lot of national healthcare systems want to know, why are you going to pay for something new? How much better is it, if at all, than something old? But we're going to start these negotiations. We've already been training therapists in Europe, and these are some of the cities where we're planning for phase 3 in Europe. Our phase 2 data that we presented was 107 patients. These were PTSD patients from all different causes, some veterans, some childhood sexual abuse, adult rape and assault, workplace accidents, and it was done in Canada, Switzerland, Israel, and the United States, so 107 people. Now, these are chronic treatment-resistant PTSD patients. So these are the hardest to treat. And what we showed is that in our therapy alone, the inactive placebo or the low dose, that 23% of them no longer had PTSD at the 2-month follow-up, at the primary outcome measure. So that shows that the therapy itself can be very effective, and that we're really trying our best to do what we can without the MDMA. But when you add MDMA, after 2 sessions, it's 55% no longer have PTSD. Now, we've also done with 3 sessions, and it goes up even more, it's 61%. But then one of the common criticisms, and there was just a criticism from Jeffrey Lieberman, who's head of psychiatry at Columbia, yesterday in Medscape, and he was basically going against this is bad because it just makes people feel good, and that can't be therapy. And he completely misunderstood what's going on. He had this idea, it's ecstasy, so you just take it and your problems go away. And so his question was, they're going to come back. And so the real question is really, what is the long-term effects? 2 months is pretty good for a long-term, but we've also done a 1-year or more follow-up, and we showed that it's 2/3 now no longer have PTSD from chronic. So, you know, not all of this is attributable to MDMA, of course, because people can do other things, but people are motivated to do other treatments, and they're continuing to get better. So there's something long-lasting. It's not just a psychedelic afterglow. We learned that the cause of PTSD is irrelevant. We can enroll people with PTSD from any cause. We learned that the low doses have enhanced blinding, but have this anti-therapeutic effect, that we can establish safety, and that we have a medium to large effect size, which is what motivated FDA to do breakthrough therapy. But here's, I think, the main point that I want to make as far as this conference, and it's the 2 different ways to move forward with psychedelics for palliative care or psychedelics for MDMA for PTSD. And one of them is what's called expanded access, and the other is petitions and initiatives, legal routes on a state level basis. And so expanded access is compassionate use. It's something that the Republicans have been trying to pass, what are called right to try laws in many states, that people should have, if they have a life-threatening illness and the currently available treatments have not helped them, they should have a right to try drugs that are in the drug development process even before they've been approved. So expanded access is a way in which FDA has formalized that. And what they say is, under FDA statute, a sponsor or a physician may submit an expanded access request for widespread access to an investigational product if certain criteria are met. There was just a hearing a couple weeks ago about expanded access and right to try, and Scott Gottlieb, who's the head of the FDA, was testifying. And here's what he said. In recent years, FDA has received over 1,000 applications annually for expanded access to treat patients with investigational drugs and biologics. FDA authorizes 99% of these requests. Emergency requests for individual patients are usually granted immediately over the phone, and non-emergency requests are generally processed within a few days. So the expanded access program really works. While the agency permits almost all expanded access applications, it makes meaningful change in approximately 10% to enhance patient safety. Medications can be adjusted, et cetera. So I really think that the initiative process is not going to pass, too expensive, and it's not necessary. And that the expanded access route is the way to go. And what you need to have, he says, we recently awarded a 5-year blanket purchase agreement to a strategic consulting firm to assist FDA with modernizing regulatory science and advancing medical products, and evaluation of the expanded access program is the first task. And then he concludes, patients receiving treatment through expanded access may have more advanced disease than clinical trial participants, multiple diseases. That means dual diagnosis. They can be PTSD but addicted to substance abuse disorders, or be receiving other drugs at the same time. So it works, and I think the expanded access program is really the way to go. And once you start phase 3 studies and you show that there's a waiting list, and you have people in your studies that can't get in, you can apply for expanded access. You can actually apply even in the phase 2 stage. And I believe that if people wanted to do that, once the psilocybin moves forward for, they're going to start with a phase 2 study and then prepare for moving into phase 3. Once they start that phase 3, I think clinicians should be able to get expanded access permission for psilocybin for end-of-life related anxiety. How these drugs are going to be regulated is a big question. And then the FDA has a program called REMS, and it was actually early on with thalidomide. Thalidomide was the big bad drug, but thalidomide is now a medicine, and the FDA has approved it as a medicine. It's useful in certain cancers and leprosy. And so there's special procedures to make sure that no pregnant women get prescribed thalidomide. And out of that kind of concern now has developed this whole program called Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. For MDMA, and I think this is true for psilocybin as well, we're going to propose that once a drug is approved as a medicine, generally any doctor can prescribe it for anything. And we're going to say that that's not the way we think it should be regulated. That it should, because we're not talking about the drug as the treatment, it's drug-assisted psychotherapy. So only people that have been trained in the psychotherapy should be able to prescribe the drug. And it's never going to be a take-home medicine. It should always be prescribed under direct supervision of the therapists. And that's the only way that we've proven safety and efficacy, and I think that's the responsible way to go. And there'll be certain kind of safety criteria as well. We have a big training program. Online courses, week-long in person, home assignments, a second week-long in person, then evaluation and supervision, and then the option is to receive MDMA. We don't feel that we can require people to take MDMA, therapists, as part of their training, but we're unlikely to hire anybody to work on phase 3 that doesn't want to take MDMA. Some of the Israeli therapists that we were working with were traditional psychiatrists. We were working at the largest mental hospital in Israel, Be'er Yaakov Mental Health Center, and one of them said that she would be scared to take MDMA herself. And then later she decided she wasn't prepared to offer the therapy. So I think we don't want to create a cult. We don't want to say you must take these drugs, but we'd be reluctant, as I said, to work with somebody that didn't want to know from the inside out what these drugs actually do. One of the biggest regulatory challenges for us is going to be off-label prescriptions, and this is where we get into the possibility, and you'll hear from Phil about the work with MDMA that's already been done for life-threatening anxiety with life-threatening illnesses. To what extent will FDA permit off-label prescriptions? And it's something very difficult for FDA to block. The pharmaceutical industries have sued FDA to try to keep off-label prescriptions going. Off-label means prescribing it for something different than it's been approved for. And so what we're going to propose is that there be off-label prescriptions, but that there be some sort of a patient registry, a sort of a patient registry light that gives us information as the sponsor what actually are people using this for. So it'll still be only people that we've trained, only in clinic settings, but we believe that once MDMA is approved, it will be available for more than just PTSD. The DEA, when Marinol was first approved around '86 for nausea control for cancer chemotherapy, the DEA tried to block off-label prescription because they said it was a controlled substance. And the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association and others objected, and they had to withdraw that ruling. And Mike Klein, who was just recently retired actually, as the head of the FDA's controlled substances staff, in a conversation I had with him a couple weeks ago, he said that off-label prescription, even for controlled substances, is something that the FDA does not have the legal authority to prohibit. Big question is going to be insurance. How do we get this covered by insurance? This shouldn't be something that only people who can afford it are able to access it. And so there's a lot of evidence about people who have PTSD have larger healthcare costs in all other areas. So we think this will be possible. Eventually we'll have these psychedelic therapy clinics, and one day you'll be able to go to Google Maps and say, where's the psychedelic clinics? And there'll be thousands of them, just like hospice centers. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the extra time.
Oh, sure. Thank you both. Don, did you want to mention your current book? Your new book?
Yeah, the one thing I didn't get a chance to mention is I have a new book out called Changing Our Minds, Psychedelic Sacraments in the New Psychotherapy, where I profile a lot of folks, including Rick and Phil, who'll be speaking next. And it's about, so I've interviewed researchers, research subjects. There's 2 chapters in there about people with life-threatening diagnosis being helped with psilocybin and MDMA, and I interview the patients in quite a bit of depth, and you can hear their stories. So we can't sell books here, but there's a sample copy out on the front desk there, and there's information about how to get the book, or just see me afterwards. I have my card there and a brochure outside, so thanks.
And actually, there's a coupon code for attendees, so the coupon codes are at the registration desk, so attendees would get 25% off.
Yeah.
Okay, well, now we're going to welcome our next panel. Thank you so much for this. So we are very pleased to have with us Dr. Phil Wolfson, Dr. Leanna Standish. You are from?
The Bay Area.
The Bay Area. Dr. Standish is from Bastyr University, and I will let you two present anything else about yourselves that you want to say.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Catherine Tucker for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to cast a spell over all of us for a moment in the grand sense of being brothers and sisters in this auditorium. I want that spell to cover us and bring us into some sense of unity. And since we're all talking about helping people, I want us all to cast the spell of being psychotherapists so we can think of ourselves in helping roles. Okay, so values are the core of what I think psychotherapists are about. And we've been talking about access to care loosely, and we're going to talk about it in greater depth. But right now, with savage, narcissistic, sociopathic individuals at the helm and threatening us with nuclear war and threatening us with the end of Medicare and Social Security, which is actively being approached right now, and threatening us with the demise of healthcare in the United States on any publicly funded level or controlled insurance level, we had better make sure our activism part of our value system is going strong, or we're really talking about not very much here to people who can afford to come to us. So I think the inner aspect of values and the outer aspect have to merge, and we, in Stan Grof's old diagram of the 2 circles, we live 1 foot in this realm and 1 foot in the limitlessness of our minds. And we need to have treatments that we describe and talk about in this room also affect how we behave in the world. So we are about values. All of us are. And we're talking here in my framework as a psychotherapist of over 40 years and a psychiatrist about what does that really mean. We're very excited about bringing new therapies into this world. I'm going to focus on ketamine and MDMA and the deep roots of these therapies. So I've got to get my sense of this going. So the influences on this work come from MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, from psychedelic consciousness and therapeutics, historically and now, from traumatology, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today is trauma, from analytic psychotherapy, from secular Buddhism and meditative practice, from social activism and the quest for justice for all, from IFS, or internal family systems, and system therapy, which opened our eyes beyond the individual, from the experience that altruism trumps individualism most of the time, from deep ecology, and much more. In other words, we have to be broad-minded. We have to be in touch with so many realms. We have to be in our interconnectedness to be good therapists. There is no such thing as value-free psychotherapy or psychotherapists. Values need to be explicit and prejudice is owned. There is no such thing as an all-encompassing method that works for everyone and all the time. All methods reflect their possibilities and limitations and the ability of the practitioner. Our being as methodologically educated, broad-minded, and flexible in approach, focusing on the uniqueness of each individual, is the most successful therapeutic strategy. There are better and less adept therapies and therapists, and no one of us has it all. Every one of us struggles with life and how to live it. Suffering is inevitable, and coping with it is variable in our effectiveness. Any of us may become overwhelmed. Knowing impermanence, in the deep sense, is a prerequisite for living consciously. Living consciously is the best shot most of the time. Denial has its place sometimes. Breaking attachments and reviewing their place in life is an imperative in this work. So is having fun, although this life is full of difficulties and the unacceptable. It can be overwhelming and dreadful. Not everyone can recover from trauma and loss. It just may go too deep. So as much as possible in this value system I'm talking about, it is about transcending to having fun and joy and relishing the preciousness of being alive. There are so many ways to do this. There are no failures in grieving or feeling lost and hurt. Conscious living is relevant and relative to all and to our individual capacities, which need to be recognized and affirmed. It is all a balancing and rebalancing act. Loving, validating, and sharing are the best therapies. So, go. What happened? And that's about conscious living. Okay. Okay, so I use a Buddhist kind of framework for looking at this. Historically, I think it's very effective and simple. You go through the view, which controls the path, which controls the outcome or the fruits, and they're all reciprocal. So the view, awaken awareness to past and present pain and trauma, to being with shame and blame, patterns and parts, obsessions and depression, to situating self clearly in time and space, to recognizing prejudice and unkindness internally and externally. We're creating a context, facilitating the guiding meta-mind, our higher self, for increased sensitivity to self with the capital S and others, for checking in with others and watching our judgments and their applications to self and others, for clarity and energy, for a moral, loving, meaningful, and connected life. Liberated mind. This is what we like in psychedelics a lot. Liberated mind from attachments and filters, the way we see the world. It opens us up to create opportunity and new perspective, to the limitlessness of mind and presence, to the needs of the heart and spirit, to victimless pleasures, to a creative life, to courage and activism, to liking oneself without ego aggrandizement to a sense of growth and realization. Path. Historically, there are two paths in psychedelic work. They coexist and they're moving along. One path relies principally on a substance to provide healing. This is done in an individual or group context with eye shades and music, often with ritual that may be cultural in nature. Integration follows and may not be specific to the person. And in our model, we have LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, mescaline misspelled, which are the major ways in which these substances are used and continue to be used. The second stream is basically empathogenic. It involves conscious work using medicines or dosages that are empathogenic in impact and are conducive to explicit psychological, emotional, and spiritual work. Individually or in groups, MDMA and low-dose ketamine are used this way. So, in terms of the path, as the only legal psychoactive substance, ketamine as a medicine offers the possibilities of trance and transformation. It's what I'm working with Overground. It's available to all of us. We should all consider the merits of using ketamine for end of life, for life-threatening illness, for psychotherapy. It is a wonderful drug when used in assisted psychotherapy, which we'll talk about a bit, and it's accessible, off-label, as Rick was talking about, with a burgeoning use in anesthesiologists' hands, in clinics all across the country for treatment-resistant depression at dosages that are attempted to be not psychedelic, but always are to some extent. So what does the trance state produce? Basically, it produces a left out fruit. Okay, this is what we want from psychotherapy: clarity, energy, compassion, etc. That's the fruit of all this work, and that's a beautiful slide. So we'll get to the next one. So a time free of depressive mind, open to new inputs. That's extraordinarily present most of the time with ketamine work. At low dose, consciously present people, a time to drift and feel liberated from emotional shackles, and a time out from ordinary mind. Those are the three key aspects of ketamine low dose work. Sessions are about 3 hours long, and we work consciously with people. And it almost always, depending on dose, and sometimes with people not responding, because basically of rigid personality, we move to real relief in the moment from depression, and we can talk more about the mechanics. With higher dosage, we're looking at a time out of the constraints of body sensations and afflictive consciousness. I'll tell you a story about that, and in our work, we're collaborative. Almost there. So, life-threatening illness. I wonder what happened to that other slide. One of the things I want to really bring to our attention as we talk about this is that the trauma of having a life-threatening illness is deep. I am in Seattle. My eldest son, Noah, was at Swedish Hospital many years ago with a bone marrow transplant. He was 16 and he went on to die with 4 years of treatment from ALL. And I can speak personally to the trauma in the time frame of dealing with a child's illness, its impact on family, community. And so that's informed my work. And when Rick asked me to do the MDMA study we did with life-threatening illness, that was part of our mutual awareness that I knew about this. And I've reframed this trauma. Too often we narrow boundaries. We talk about depression, we talk about anxiety, but really it's a whole systemic shakeup. And we really need to attend to that. Most of our measures confine us or look for indications for drug use with FDA or whatever confines us. We really want to look at the whole person, their community, and their system. This is a little advanced. Rick helped me out by having someone set up these slides for me. I usually am very verbose on my slides, so I'm a little ahead of myself. So in our evolving work with traumatized humans in settings that use MDMA and ketamine, we attempt to effect the healing from trauma that enables stricken persons to live more fruitful, vital, here and now lives. This enables putting trauma in perspective. So the experience of a life-threatening illness, I want to list some of the factors. You can look at these. I think we need to take these and more into consciousness as we work with people. Okay. All right.
Help is on the way.
Okay, leaving a mark. These are the concerns that people bring to us. Okay. And they're multiple. People have a sense of being disabled from diagnosis on, and as one of our speakers said, ideally, if we could work with people right from the start of diagnosis with psychedelics and with assisted psychotherapy, we'd be helping very many people. So we've done that. I'm sorry for this. So we've done all of that. So these are all the things about ketamine, and we've discussed some of that. Psychedelic effects and interruption of ordinary consciousness plays a fundamental role in achieving these states. So trauma often leaves scars on the survivor. Trauma can alter attitude towards life. And MDMA, in the study I'm about to show you, enables putting trauma in perspective and cultivating alternative patterns of mind and behavior. And these are some of the aspects of MDMA and ketamine for palliative care. While these substances, ketamine at high dose is a hallucinogen, but at lower dose, mild hallucinations not essential. And there is a facilitation, nonetheless, from both substances for mystical experiences to happen. This is our MDMA site. This is my home, where we did an 18-subject study of MDMA and life-threatening illness. Just concluding, it was probably the most intensive study of a psychotherapy-based modality ever done for this indication. When I read the literature for psilocybin and other things, MAPS sponsored something that's truly profound. This is my co-therapist on the, over here, Julaine Andrews. That's one of our subjects, a young woman who had breast cancer and with 3 children and is terribly frightened by that and has come such a long way, one of our early subjects. This is our study design. I won't take you through it, but it goes on over 6 months with a 12-month follow-up. These are a tabulation of some of the results. We used numerous measures, and invariably we had wonderful results. This is the principal outcome measure, the state trait anxiety trait subscale. You can see, I won't try and explain all this, there's a placebo control to the study, 5 of the 18, and you can see the end of stage 1 is the comparison of the 2 sessions, placebo versus active, and then we go on for a 3rd session. Everyone gets 3 sessions, and you can see the results are conspicuously good. We meet criteria, and this is a upscale where growth on the PTGI, and we looked at trauma as much as we could. We didn't do CAPS as in the PTSD study. Shows really good results. People come back from their trauma, become more functional. This is the BDI, and the results, again, are quite wonderful. So just a bit about access to care. Again, to emphasize, ketamine therapy is the only legal psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy currently available. MDMA access, as Rick has described more than adequately, I won't go into. Psilocybin is in phase 2, and we hope we'll get out soon to phase 3 with probably a new indication. Ayahuasca and other plant medicines you're going to describe. and economic barriers exist. The current cost of most anesthesiologist programs are 4 to 10K for a set of sessions, and insurance does not cover directly. We have ways about that. Our particular program, which is essentially 3-hour sessions with follow-up, and we send people home with the medicine, which is pretty revolutionary, is less than half that cost. Insurance coverage is still not available. People are working on it. In the broader cultural sense, access to care amongst minorities, we had a wonderful talk at Horizons by a black sociologist who discussed the views of black people as a drug. Psychedelics are still drugs versus medicine. There's the misinformation. We still hear a lot about holes in the brain from MDMA. I'm bumbling around, so I might have some holes, but I don't think so. And viewed as counterculture and white, and there's an absence of quality controls in education abroad, in the culture itself, lack of practitioners of color. And then this is our offering. I want to end with a quick story. Some months ago, a couple came to me. They were full professors of religious studies at a noted university. And the woman, as is so typical of pancreatic cancer, had a few months to live. But she was still totally coherent. And she made a request. It's a request I'm not used to. It was a request that she wanted to see God. Okay, so not quite my field as getting people to see God. I have my own views of why I can't get that for myself, but she was nearing the end of her life. And she had been an intellectual of Indian descent and background who had been intellectually absorbed in it, but had never really felt it. And so she asked us to give her an experience. So we did an at-home session, and we did an IM ketamine, and we had prepared her with several sessions for it. She was naive to drugs, and she had an amazing session. She cried, and she was held by her husband. And when she came out of the transformational experience, she said, "I saw God." She was happy. And we had done something that truly had given her peace and a sense of self-completion at the end of her life. Now, I'm not going to business this way. I'm not going to become the Phil the God Whisperer or Phil of God, but it didn't go to my ego, but it's part of just what the promise of these kind of medicines can do in the proper setting with the proper framework. So I leave you with that. My book is available. We have just started applications for the first set of experiential sessions with ketamine for practitioners at the Ketamine Training Institute. We have a new foundation, the Ketamine Research Foundation, so I hope you'll take a look, and thank you for your patience. Thank you.
My first experience with a potent psychedelic medicine was many years ago in South America, where ayahuasca is a legal sacramental tea. After taking ayahuasca in a ceremonial setting, I said to myself, now this is a medicine worthy of its name. Along with providing profound and lasting positive physical effects that I noticed immediately, the experience of taking this powerful combination of two plants in a tea generated some very burning questions in me. For example, what is reality? What is real? What is the mind? Is the mind inside of the brain or outside of the brain? Does the body end at the skin? Does quantum entanglement between human brains actually occur? Therefore, in an effort to answer these questions, I began studying ayahuasca not only as a medicine, but also as a tool for exploring consciousness as a neuroscientist. We understand less about polymolecular substances. For example, we do not know if the molecule psilocybin that is present in the mushroom produces the identical effects as the entire mushroom eaten entirely. Similarly, we don't know if the physiological and psychological effects of individual molecular constituents that are found in ayahuasca are in fact so similar to the active constituents harmine and DMT that we shouldn't even really bother to develop a new botanical drug. And I want to point out that there's been only 2 botanical drugs that have been approved by the FDA. 2. We have other non-psychedelic plant medicines that may serve as models, and I want to point to, not that. This is a slide showing you some of the ayahuasca iconography that many of you are familiar with. This is turkey tail mushroom. Trametes versicolor is a mushroom extract that has potent immunotherapy properties in cancer treatment, and very importantly operates by 3 mechanisms. And the 3 mechanisms are by separate individual molecules within this mushroom, and there's probably other things that we don't know about. It has been posited that ayahuasca may have potential as a cancer therapy, and it may be because there are 3 separate actions of ayahuasca. One is DMT as a sigma-1 receptor in mitochondria, as an indolamine serotonin agonist, and the harmala alkaloids have been shown to produce apoptosis in cancer cells. As a scientist, I am keenly aware that medicine based on the extraction of just a single molecule is a relatively new endeavor, maybe not more than 100 years old. I'm aware that as a result of this focus, the complexity of polymolecular substances has yet to be completely understood. Therefore, my scientific training in the complexity of synergistic therapeutic pathways and my clinical training with ayahuasca have all prepared me to be particularly curious about the synergistic properties of combinations of plants. In the end, when I asked myself, well, why did I choose ayahuasca as opposed to psilocybin or MDMA, the answer is, in the end, I chose ayahuasca because I love the plants, and I love growing them. I love the complexity of making good plant medicines, and I have grown to love the healing communities that use these medicines. And it's not just in South America and Central Latin America where these psychedelic drugs have been used. This is a famous Aztec sculpture that shows on the sides you can see psychedelic medicines from the Aztec culture that have been used for antiquity. There are psilocybin mushrooms. There's also ergot, which is a fungi that have psychedelic properties. You see here the cacti that contain mescaline. The one on the right is peyote. And then Salvia divinorum is also a very interesting psychedelic medicine that is a similar molecular mechanism. And frogs. There's a species of frogs in the Sonoran Desert that has secretions in the skin that are intensely psychedelic. But in the end, I chose ayahuasca. And I want to talk a little bit about the research that's been done on ayahuasca. Spanish and Peruvian researchers have done a lot of research on the antidepressant effects of ayahuasca. There are peer-reviewed publications on the topic. We know from Dr. Osorio's group in Peru that it's an active antidepressant with long-term effects. And we also know some about the functional magnetic resonance imaging effects of ayahuasca. One of the fascinating things is that ayahuasca and many of the psychedelics produce a downregulation of the default networks of the cerebral cortex. And I show here, this is a picture of the Eleusinian mysteries, and it's recently become known that the substance that was used in this ancient Greek ritual was ergot, and LSD was found in these sites. And so we know that even in our Greco-Roman culture, that psychedelics have been used. The most psychedelic drugs used by our ancestors were administered and experienced in a group ritual session. And we all know that set and setting in psychedelic therapy work is of critical importance. The most frequent question I am asked about ayahuasca research is how will we administer ayahuasca in a Western medical setting that ignores the ritual and the group effect? And I answer that if we are to study the safety and effectiveness of ayahuasca, it may be best to start in a clinical controlled environment. And for now, we will build on the clinical research methods of Strassman, Griffith, Grobe, Mithofer, and Doblin. Ayahuasca tea will be served to an individual study volunteer in a comfortable clinical setting with at least 2 experienced clinicians present. Future researchers will have the pleasure of investigating the group effects of ayahuasca, and a new field called transpersonal medicine may soon develop. How marvelous to be, thank you, how marvelous to be in the field of psychedelic psychiatric medicine here in the West at this time, to discover and to learn from traditional ayahuasca healers in order to answer the questions such as, what words should we say during the sessions? What kind of music? What kind of lighting? What kind of touch? And of course, what dose? Our culture now more than ever needs to restore psychedelic medicine. Some argue that we need a complete phase change in our thinking. Psychedelics can do this by opening our minds, opening sensory gates, to allow us to experience the very simple truth that everything is connected. That single experience can change everything as it did in me. It can lead to compassion, and compassion can lead to peace and justice. There is a small but growing group of physicians who believe that psychedelic drugs have potential as effective therapy for depression, PTSD, and end-of-life anxiety. Ayahuasca has captured the imagination of many Westerners, including Americans, and many of us have traveled to South America for the experience of an ayahuasca ceremony. Some join churches where practitioners drink ayahuasca. And currently, there's only a few options for Americans to participate in ayahuasca ceremonies. You can travel to another country where it's legal. You can join the Santo Daime or the Unio de Vegetal Church. You can participate in growing numbers of circles all over the United States. And somebody once told me that on any given Saturday night in Manhattan, there's at least 100 ayahuasca ceremonies going on. We can also obtain illegal psychedelic drugs from another person, or we can purchase ayahuasca vine and DMT-containing leaves on the internet, because the plants are not scheduled. Only the drug that the plants make is illegal. Or option 5 is you can participate in psychedelic therapy clinical trials. We need better options for patients and physicians, not just for public safety, but for equity and access to these potentially useful therapies. And conducting FDA and DEA-approved clinical trials of ayahuasca in the United States will require a standardized, stable, potent ayahuasca extract available to clinical researchers in order to conduct these trials. And there will be physicians and scientists who want to study the effects of ayahuasca on the immune system and the nervous system. I think our collective vision is to create a new cadre of trained and certified clinicians who will administer ayahuasca to patients seeking treatment for these disorders. We envision a future where psychiatrists will conduct ayahuasca family group sessions to address existential despair that can be part of the death experience and their loved ones. The move towards FDA approval has been long and hard, And we had to learn how to make the medicines. We had to learn how to grow the the plants. We had to learn how to ferret through the DEA and FDA regulations. And it's taken $1.75 million to get to this point. And it's going to take hundreds of thousands of dollars more to get to do the phase 1 trial that the FDA has approved just last year. Now, there's several ethical questions that I just want to address before I end my comments. Is ayahuasca research and medical use an example of cultural hegemony? Ethnomedical use of ayahuasca has grown. A brisk ayahuasca tourism industry has developed in South America. I worry about the decimation of the Amazon River basin where these plants grow. I worry about wild harvesting, whether it's done sustainably. And I worry for the plants as they have now become a Western commodity and may become endangered. Is Western scientific research on ayahuasca a type of biopiracy? Is this an example of bioprospecting that exploits plants and animal species? Should one patent ayahuasca? The very idea may seem ridiculous. However, we are following here in Seattle the excellent pioneering work of MAPS that has figured out, I think, a brilliant way of how to navigate in the business world in this country. And what MAPS did is in 2014 formed a public benefit corporation that holds the patent for MDMA, that can distribute MDMA to qualified researchers and clinicians, and the profits from the sale of MDMA will go back to MAPS' mission, which is psychedelic research. We think that MAPS has the ideal strategies to synergize a wonderful quote from a conference that happened last May in Madison, Wisconsin. Awaken consciousness and the evolution of business in developing psychedelic medicines for people who need them. And in conclusion, I want to read a quote that I read in the MAPS 2016 Spring Bulletin by a man named Charles Eisenstein, and he wrote the following: psychedelics can bestow expanded consciousness, perceptions, and ways of being that are incompatible with those that undergird our society. Psychedelics have the power to subvert the alienation, competition, anthropocentrism, linear ordering of time and space, standardization of commodities and social roles, and reduction of reality to a collection of things that propel the world-destroying machine of modern civilization. Psychedelics disrupt the defining mythology of our civilization and the story of separation. I am so glad to have the opportunity to be among you as disruptors of the best sort. Those who disrupt the story of separation that lies before us, and I am honored to be with you as we seize this opportunity together. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. It's kind of a tease, right, where we tell you to use the microphone for questions and we don't take any. But we do want to, it's an embarrassment of riches today with our agenda. And lucky for you, the participants, the speakers are here, and we'll be circling among you with the food, which has been delivered for lunch. And so you'll have an ability to ask questions outside or later. So I just want to talk briefly. So first I want to thank you both again. Dr. So, for those of you who are from here, you know that we always lie and say it always rains. And you can see that the sun is shining. It's a beautiful day. So some people might be encouraged to go outside for lunch, which is great, but you will miss two incredible lunchtime speakers. Kenneth Tupper from the, I got this wrong the last time, the British Columbia Center on Substance Use, and Ethan Nadelman, the former executive director of the Drug Policy Institute.
So our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Ken Tupper. Now, according to fake news, there's a very different country just north of here. And I am told that in that country they do things a little bit differently than they do here with respect to a variety of things, including medicine, health, drug policy. At some personal risk to his well-being, Ken Tupper has come behind enemy lines to join us today to report to us from this other country about many of the interesting things they are doing, specifically on the issues that we've discussing here today of psychedelics and medicine. I have had the great pleasure of intersecting with Ken in various places and over various years at various conferences, and I can tell you that when it comes to working in and understanding the variety of issues concerning Canadian drug policy, drug research, substance abuse, treatment, prevention, and overdose, there is no person that has as wide a purview on those issues as Ken. And although he'll be focusing his remarks today on only a small subset of his knowledge, it's really tremendous to have a resource like Dr. Tupper here to talk with us. So without further ado, let me present it. Ken Tupper.
Thanks, Dan, and to the organizers of the conference, Faculty of Law here at the University of Washington. Very much appreciate the opportunity. So I'm Director of Implementation and Partnerships at the BC Centre on Substance Use, which is a new health system resource that's just been created this year in British Columbia. Is too quiet for you? So I'm also an adjunct professor at the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. And the role that I have now, I just started earlier this year after 14 years working in the Ministry of Health in British Columbia, where I was doing prevention and harm reduction policy in the Population and Public Health Division. But my academic work, which I was kind of doing concurrently, has been to pursue the idea of entheogenic education, which is what I want to talk a little bit about today and how it might apply to the considerations that we're making here around palliative care and psychedelic medicine. So I'm going to start off by talking about where my interest in this came from, and Don Lattin alluded to this a bit in his talk. Was reading this book when I was 16 years old, and if you haven't read this book, I strongly urge you to do so. Aldous Huxley's most famous for Brave New World, his most famous novel, but Island was his final novel that he really wrote as a sort of vehicle for his sort of philosophical perspectives on what is the potential of humanity, blending the best of Eastern mysticism, Western science, and traditional indigenous knowledge practices. And in this, he describes a fictional moksha medicine. And he actually amplifies, sorry, I should have mentioned the title here. I wanted to coin the term psychothanasia, a word that comes from the Greek root psyche, which means mind or spirit, and thanatos, which means to die. So psychothanasia can mean on one level, psychedelic informed death, so what we're talking about here, but it can also perhaps reflect the sort of death of the ego that can sometimes happen under the influence of psychedelic drugs. So Aldous Huxley, as Don had mentioned, used LSD on his deathbed, but he'd used it for a number of years prior to that, after being introduced first to mescaline by a Canadian physician, in fact, who was basically promoting the use of psychedelics for therapeutic tools, but Aldous Huxley heard about their potential for mystical experience, and he really strongly believed that these were really, really powerful tools. I heard that he'd said of the discoveries in the 20th century, he put LSD, the discovery of LSD, in the same equivalency as the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA and the splitting of the atom. So, of course, Huxley was very interested in traditional ceremonial uses of plants and the spiritual dimensions. So the term entheogen, if you don't know, was coined by some anthropologists to be an alternative to the word psychedelic, which kind of connotes the psychedelic 60s, the art and culture of the counterculture. But the various plants have been used for religious or ceremonial purposes, so tobacco, peyote, iboga, psilocybin mushrooms, datura, cannabis, and ayahuasca. And I want to make what I think is a helpful distinction between entheogenic healing and psychedelic medicine, where we can see sort of two different paradigms, the plant-based approaches and the sort of plant or fungus as the substance, but the sort of etiology, the understanding of the origin and trajectory of illness is understood to be more spiritual. Healing is explained through more magical principles. Context in which these are administered happens in groups, typically led by a shaman or a healer, curandero, and often with typically with ritual protocols. Sort of quite a contrast from the more standard clinical biomedical clinical approach that we are taking with the sort of white powders that are extracted from these plants. So I think the important lesson here is that they could both be potential modalities for healing, but they're very different, and it's perhaps incumbent upon us as researchers to consider what the best ways to go are, or applying both in respective situations. So again, Don alluded to this, that psychedelic research was strong in the 1950s. It was actually part of the psychopharmacology revolution. Discovery of LSD coincided with interest in serotonin as a neurotransmitter and led to a lot of early neuroscience research in that direction. Hundreds of studies published. But there was methodological challenges. There was also at the same time in the early 1960s a move towards the randomized control double-blind study as the gold standard for scientific research and truth in medical science, which was actually very difficult for some of the researchers to sort of grapple with in terms of their understanding of therapeutic relationships being the most important thing with psychedelics. And of course the covert military and intelligence agency research that was going on at the time. Non-medical use and the counterculture, of course, further derailed things when young people started talking about crazy ideas like peace, love, growing and eating organic vegetables. That was, I think, truly seen to be a threat to the military-industrial consumerist complex, as Leanna alluded to. So what this led to was the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, which was already in the works, started to be informed by the backlash against psychedelics and put in place very strong controls, essentially defining these as Schedule I substances at the international level, not just here in the United States, by definition having no medical use. And of course, the twin pillars of the United Nations are supply reduction and demand reduction. And the effect of this, essentially was to keep these drugs out of the hands of scientists and doctors, and not so much to keep them off the streets. But Dr. David Nutt in the UK has basically equated the repression of research into psychedelics as equivalent only to the repression of astronomy research with telescopes by church fathers in the 16th century. That these two things are equivalent in the history of science in terms of the sort of repression of worldviews and the potential paradigm shifts that they can sort of precipitate. Fortunately, we're seeing a change now, and this is an example of an article we published in Canada in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, where essentially the Canadian Medical Association Journal actually published some of the early psychedelic research back in the 60s, hadn't touched the topic in 40 years, and we approached the editors to see if they'd be interested, and they said, maybe, and in the end they ended up putting on the cover and doing a podcast interview with Matt Johnson, one of our co-authors, and it just sort of shows the shift that's now happening in the medical establishment to, I think, really start to take these things more seriously. I've heard George Goldsmith, who was mentioned earlier in the UK, and Compass Pathways has talked about pushing on open doors. We perceive closed doors, but once you start to actually push on them, there seems that there's a lot more acceptability than we might think. But I want to challenge us to think beyond just the medical paradigm. And this is, again, where I was really impelled by the metaphor of plant teachers that I came across in reading about particularly ayahuasca, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation, the globalization of ayahuasca and its emergence out of South America. But the idea is that psychedelics or entheogens can be tools for cognitive enhancement, creativity and imagination, provide a sense of purpose and meaning, and really sort of precipitate experiences of wonder and awe, which are crucial to positive psychology, but very much undervalued, I would say, in contemporary education or contemporary school systems in a way that we might want to reflect on when we start to see the results of the new scientific research and what it's demonstrating. So I'm not going to even get into the sort of clinical uses and the treatment of illnesses, but some of the studies on healthy human subjects showing ayahuasca can be associated with increased mindfulness capacity, LSD with increased openness and optimism, as well as nature-relatedness, psilocybin with increased openness, and just a week or two ago, Roland Griffiths' lab looking at psilocybin with increased pro-social attitudes and behaviors and healthy psychological functioning when conjoined with meditation practices. Also, some really promising research is on sort of population level data where we ask people about their drug use patterns and starting to do some of the data mining to look at the correlations with psychedelic drug use, where we're finding, you know, the exact opposite of the sort of dominant narrative of, you know, take LSD and you jump out a window, it somehow creates suicidality. Well, in fact, it seems to be exact opposite. So Peter Hendricks at the University of Alabama has done some really excellent work, and a number of these findings are from his work. But we just published in Canada a few weeks ago a similar study on reduced suicidality among sex workers who had reported lifetime use of psychedelics, but also intimate partner violence, antisocial criminality, recidivism. So in terms of explanatory mechanisms, you know, again, there's competing paradigms. This sort of standard neuroscience approach is to look at the receptor agonists, serotonin receptor agonists that these are working on, the default mode network, and how it's reducing blood flow in certain key networks of the brain that perhaps allow for crosstalk between different parts of the brain that aren't normally in connection with each other. The psychedelic therapy paradigm, of course, has to take into account things like set, the psychological expectations of the patient, setting, the physical environment in which they're taking these, the substance or the dose. There's definitely a pharmacological factor, but most importantly, perhaps the therapeutic clinician-patient relationship, and sort of building that to start off with, so there's a sense of trust and sort of bond that one goes into to start off with. So in terms of the implications for the topic of this conference, certainly we can see scientific research advancing in neuroscience, psychiatry, and particularly we would like to see palliative care. I would challenge us to think about not just maybe administering these substances to the individual who's about to, at the end of their life, but perhaps also the family. There may be some real bonding that could go on where and this is already being done with some of the MDMA studies where they're doing conjoint therapy with a person with PTSD and their intimate partner to see if they can get better therapeutic outcomes. So it may be that families could really experience sort of healing with the sort of imminent loss of a loved one. Funding is, of course, a huge challenge. To date, I believe most of the funding for psychedelic research around the world is coming out of philanthropic donations, for sure not out of the pharmaceutical industry. It's definitely, as was mentioned earlier, perhaps anathema to their business models. These are non-patentable medications used in short courses of treatment with really promising therapeutic effects. It's very much different from the sort of daily dispensed medication that masks symptoms and never really gets to the root of anything, but does well for shareholder profits. Government funding agencies such as the NIH or in Canada, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, haven't yet really sort of come to the table, but it's possible they may. This is where I'm hopeful that in the Canadian context, where we actually do have socialized medicine, government is on the hook for funding healthcare. They may actually want to step up and see the sort of reduction in health system costs that may be sort of a result of more effective treatments using psychedelic medicines. Jurisprudence and legal scholarship. It was pointed out that in Canada we now have medically assisted dying as a result of a Supreme Court decision. So that's very promising in terms of options, although there's many patient advocates who are saying that what was put in place in terms of legislation doesn't go far enough. It's very restrictive. So there's more work to be done on that, but certainly you want to sort of echo Ira's comments this morning that perhaps the use of psychedelics may give people a different perspective on whether or not they want to avail themselves of this opportunity to have medically assisted death. Cognitive liberty issues. I guess unfortunately for the United States is your Bill of Rights does not include freedom of thought. unlike the UN Declaration on Human Rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where we actually do have freedom of thought protected. So there may be sort of ways to look at freedom of thought as sort of, if one does not have freedom to alter one's consciousness with particular kinds of cognitive tools, then what kind of freedom do we really have? And I just want to sort of point out Richard Glenn Boyer as a pioneer in the area of cognitive liberty with respect to psychedelics and entheogens. Health professional education, for many healthcare practitioners, all they've learned about psychedelic drugs is that they're highly dangerous, have no medical value, and everybody should stay away from them. So I think there's a lot of unlearning that might need to be done in sort of currently practicing medical practitioners. But for people who are in medical or nursing or psychology or social work schools, perhaps we can look at influencing curricula to have those be informed by the new scientific findings in this area. When I get approached by young people at conferences like this who ask, do you think I should get into this? I can't talk to my professors. I've got, I'm reading all the maps, I'm reading what's coming out, and I'm really excited by it, but I don't talk about it. And I tell them, yes, I think it's going to be a huge opportunity for future practitioners where the limitation on accessing these kinds of treatments is not going to be the drugs themselves, it's going to be the trained practitioners who know how to administer them. So to get in at a sort of young age right now as an early professional is probably going to be a major sort of career opportunity in the future, and I sort of want to reiterate that. One of the challenges, my work has been in education, and I was working in the area of prevention and drug education for many years, and sort of wondering how do we come to terms in sort of what we're telling kids in schools about drugs when we know these sort of past approaches of let's not tell anything potentially positive about these things because we want kids to believe that they're highly dangerous and thus not be sort of curious to try them. It's going to be more and more difficult to reconcile. I think it's already difficult with the internet. In the past, withholding knowledge, I think was never really a good educational approach. But in the age of the internet, when you can download, how to cook crystal meth recipes and order on the dark net, using Bitcoin, various kinds of high potency opioids, I think it's time to think about drug education in a much more honest way, and to think again about how we're going to incorporate findings from clinical research and psychedelics into school-based drug education. In terms of public policy, this is something that we've given some thought to with colleagues of mine at the Ministry of Health in British Columbia, Dr. Brian Emerson and Mark Hayden, working with the Health Officers Council of British Columbia, where we've tried to articulate a post-prohibition model for a public health-based approach to regulating psychedelic drugs. So I don't have time here to go through the full inventory of options, but certainly thinking about how to engage with health professional regulatory bodies such as colleges of physicians, colleges of nurses, etc., to think about how they're going to deal with this emerging area of healthcare, psychedelic medicine, to think about perhaps a new class of health professional, a psychedelic supervisor, who may be a medical professional, but may also just have a sort of a strong skill set in guiding psychedelic sessions, and maybe very much informed by shamanic type practices. I think we really need to also look at traditional indigenous knowledge and realize that these tools, although they may be new to us, are actually very ancient, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel necessarily, that we could really learn a lot from being respectful and sort of take a post-colonial approach. Instead of assuming everything indigenous people did was wrong and bad, let's flip it on its head and assume that they're telling the truth when they speak about the tremendous value of these plant-based substances. So I'm going to leave it there. And I don't know if we have time for questions, if anybody wants to ask one, or...
Hi. My question is... Microphone. Hi. So I'm wondering, many of us who have used psychedelics have had people who did not come back from the journey the same. And I'm wondering, do we have tools to screen patients of who would be good candidates for this, so that we're not putting people at,
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually a really important point. I should have mentioned that during my talk. For sure, these are not necessarily for everybody. I think there's really sort of reason for caution in terms of people who have a history of psychosis, bipolar disorder, certain sort of mental illnesses. But the areas in which we're seeing clinical research results of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders. We just published recent findings on ayahuasca and eating disorders. Those kinds of mental illnesses seem to be the ones that are going to be most responsive to this. So for sure, that's again part of the research, is to figure out for whom these tools are most appropriate and how to screen appropriately for them. I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to make a sort of pronouncement about that, but it's for sure part of the research program. And right now, the research that is happening is being very sort of cautious with respect to who's being admitted to trials.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for your talk. The development of psychedelics and entheogens as a safe space for spiritual, legitimate religious spiritual practitioners in various churches around the world, as supported by international treaties that you've written about. I'm just wondering, where do you see the role of doctors and health professionals and sort of the medical scientific community becoming more engaged with crossing into that space? And the reason I'm asking in the context of palliative care is because palliative practitioners have been crossing into spiritual health care systems, and there was a chaplain earlier who spoke. It's very much a joint effort between sort of spiritual specialists, spiritual care specialists, and medical specialists and social workers, and so we have that kind of interdisciplinary model. Might it be easier to utilize some of the already existing frameworks that religious systems have been allowed under international treaties and charter rights in your country and under the Supreme Court in the United States in very controlled settings? And some doctors have done this. Dr. Halpern went to study peyote in the Native American church. He wrote a small paper. Some folks have gone down to South America, but I don't see much North American church and spiritual system practices that are being kind of infiltrated by medical ethnographers. So maybe that should get funded. Maybe we can learn a lot of things and kind of fuse those two models together.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Sunil. And the word health, of course, comes from the root of a Germanic root of the word whole. So to bring together health and spirituality, or medicine and spirituality in a way that's been divorced, in the sort of era of modernity, I think is something that's really urgent, especially in the area of palliative care. But I would argue more generally in the application of medicine and in the sort of contemporary ecological situation in which we find ourselves, to think about a kind of more eco-oriented sort of frame could be precipitated again by spiritual practitioners who work with these kinds of plants, bringing together the medical applications. I think there's a lot to be done in that area for sure, and I'm glad that you brought it up. Maybe one more, and then it's time for Ethan talk. Oh, we're done. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And like Ken's biographical materials, Ethan Nadelman's biographical materials are printed out for you at some length, so I won't repeat them. But let me just say that Ethan Nadelman, as the founder of the Drug Policy Alliance and for 22 years the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, created the leading organization in the U.S. devoted to ending the war on drugs. And I'm privileged to introduce him to you. In my mind, he has been the chief connector of dots. He has connected the dots between the U.S. punitive prohibitionist drug policies and the mass criminalization of U.S. citizens that has led to the overflow of our jails and our prisons. He's connected the dots between our drug war and the erosion, steady erosion of our civil liberties, between our punitive prohibitionist drug policies and the explosion of hepatitis C, HIV, and other bloodborne illnesses, the persistence of untreated but yet treatable addictions, and our current epidemic of overdose morbidity and mortality. But as importantly, Ethan has been a connector of dots between drugs and the potential real benefits of drug use for individuals, families, and communities in terms of how drugs and drug use can promote wellness for medical purposes, psychological and spiritual. And so with that, let me bring up the person who hired me, gave me a job for 20 years, and whom I deeply, deeply admire, Ethan Nadelman.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that introduction, also for your role in helping to organize this. So just, I hope you'll permit me, and because it is a luncheon talk, I'm going to be a little more personal in my comments here, in part because I'm not running anything anymore. I stepped down almost 6 months ago from running the organization Drug Policy Alliance that I created many years ago. And just to explain a little more what Dan said, I've been involved really for 35 years studying and teaching and advocating around the issue of drug policy. First as a graduate student, then as an assistant professor at Princeton in the late 80s and early 90s, and then meeting the philanthropist George Soros, creating an activist think tank called the Lindesmith Center, named after a prominent sociologist, Alfred Lindesmith, creating international harm reduction programs under Soros and beginning to fund much of this movement. And then in 2000, merging my organization, Lindesmith Center, with another organization, the Drug Policy Foundation, with which I've been deeply involved, to create the Drug Policy Alliance. And so our work has really, as Dan said, covered the spectrum of drug policy reform, with about a third of it focusing on cannabis reform, going back to the first medical marijuana initiatives back in the mid-90s. The second part of it involving the issues of mass incarceration, especially the drug war contribution to mass incarceration, undoing that. And the third element involving the proactive efforts to deal with drug use and addiction as health issues, not criminal issues. So that's been the key of work. And now, because I did step down about 6 months ago, and so I've been on a period not so much of reflection about the past, but really about this next stage of life for myself and also where the world's going. I mean, I stepped down on May 1st, I turned 60 on March 13th, and I've been thinking about this. And by somewhat of a coincidence, I should just reveal that earlier this week, I had an opportunity to do a psychedelic journey. And it was one of the most profound of my life just a few days ago. Reminded me of one that I did almost 30 years ago, which helped clarify that my calling in life would be to do the work that I did. And interestingly, it was a group session, and the leader, the shaman who directed it in the discussion before we began to consume the substances, what he chose to do was to lead a conversation built around showing clips from a recent movie called A Monster Calls. I don't know if any of you have seen this movie, A Monster Calls. But it's basically the story of a young adolescent boy who calls up in his dreams a tree monster in order to help him deal with the trauma of his mother's terminal illness. And the connection between that having happened just a few days ago and then being here at this conference just sort of helps. It's one of those serendipitous things that just adds meaning to life. So let me just say a few things. First of all, it's a pleasure here to be in Seattle, in King County, in Washington State, at the university. And for those of you who don't know and are associated, how many of you are from here, by the way? Is it about half of you or more? Just so you know, this area holds a special place in the history of drug policy reform. I mean, you should know that when we did the first medical marijuana initiative in 1996 in California, the question was where to go next, and Washington State was clear. We're going there, and in 98 we came up here, a bunch of other states, Oregon, Alaska, Colorado, Nevada, and Maine. But this was a pivotal state for moving forward with medical marijuana and was a leader. And it obviously more recently was the first with Colorado for legalizing marijuana. I'm very delighted at the role that Drug Policy Alliance played, not so much in drafting that law, but in really helping raise a major portion of the funding for that. It's a place where you may not know, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, a brilliant attorney, Fred Nolan, became chair of the King County Bar Association, decided to make drug policy his focus for the year, and landed up creating a King County, Bar Association, Medical Association, then Washington State Bar and Medical Association, kind of gathering, bringing both medical and doctors together on a multi-year process that led to the creation of the single most path-breaking document in the United States about moving drug policy from a criminal justice model to a much more public health, human rights, decriminalization model. The first staff director of that, Roger Goodman, became a prominent politician in this state. The ACLU in this state, headed by Kathleen Taylor, became the first ACLU chapter in the country to hire a full-time longtime drug policy person. And I should say that one of my last times here, some of you may remember Professor Alan Marlatt, who taught here. But I remember going back, and Alan Marlatt and I, in our organization, Linda Smith Center, University of Washington, I think the Health Something Center, organizing the first international conference on reducing opioid overdose fatalities back in January 2000. And that was here at the University of Washington, where Seattle was suffering with a very serious problem in that time. So this has really held a special place, and it's something you should be proud of, and it makes all the more sense why this cutting-edge issue is being hosted here. The second thing, as I was sitting in the audience and I was listening to Ira by a talk before, and I'm going, he was reminding me of a colleague of mine, this extraordinary woman named Kathy Foley. Kathy Foley was for a few decades at least, the head of pain management in Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York. And when George Soros decided to begin engaging in philanthropy in the United States in the early 90s, the first two projects he picked were drug policy and death and dying with dignity. And he picked me to head the drug policy and Kathy to head the one on death and dying. And so for many years, she sat in the office right next to mine, and we became relatively good friends and colleagues. And part of what that relationship involved was us teaching a bit one another about these issues. Right? And so I started a speaker series back then, the Linda Smith Center speaker series, but I would have Rick Doblin and Rick Straussman with his DMT research, and Charlie Grove from UCLA, and Sasha Shulgin, the brilliant creator of many of these mind-altering substances, come in and speak, and be pulling in Kathy to meet these people and to talk to them, because it was already apparent that we needed to be thinking about these issues of death and dying with dignity and psychedelics in tandem. And she was educating me around the issue of opioids and the under-treatment of pain. And now, of course, we look at this through this lens of the incredible over-promotion and over-marketing and the almost criminal activities of Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical companies in this area. But what we forget, now that we're engaged in dealing with this crisis, is the extent to why people coined the term, why John Morgan coined the term opiophobia in the late 1980s, and the profound fear of patients and nurses and doctors to prescribe, to recommend, to utilize, to consume opioids, not for chronic pain, which has created the problem today, but with problems involving terminal pain, people dying of horrible cancer pain and other things, people coming out of traumatic surgery, and doctors and nurses and even patients refusing to take the substances which could have alleviated their pain, right? And oftentimes hastening their death because of their reluctance to do that. I remember, I seen Don Layden put the names up there of, not just Timothy Lear and Houston Smith, but of Andy Weil, who had such a profound influence on me and was something of a mentor, and Ram Dass. And I remember bringing in Ram Dass before he had his stroke. And I remember, because I wanted to introduce Ram Dass and Kathy Foley. And the two of them bringing them out, this must have been 1995, I think. It was before Ram Dass' stroke. And in comes Ram Dass. His hair was no longer as long as it was there, but, with his worry beads. And Kathy Foley, straight-laced, Catholic, anti-assisted suicide, but with this massive heart and about we could almost eliminate the need for assisted suicide if only we treated the terminal pain effectively. And sitting with the two of them for this brilliant 2-hour conversation where at one point Kathy says to Ram Dass, for some of my most traditional, conservative, Upper East Side, wealthy patients, the thing they find most valuable as they're approaching their death is nothing I can do that for them. It's that your tapes on being present, Ram Dass. And that kind of coming together in that way. And so, it's those were some early origins of this stuff. I remember when we created the organization for which we did the first California Medical Marijuana Initiative on medical marijuana in California 1996, we initially called it Americans for Medical Rights. And in 97, as we were thinking about which initiatives to do next, one of the issues we considered was whether to include in the initiatives better access to opioids and other types of medication for dealing with pain, not just medical marijuana. And talking to Kathy and others, they said, Ethan, please don't bring us into your medical marijuana thing now. It's just too controversial. Just give us some space on this. And we just abandoned that and didn't do it. But there was that thinking going on early on. Now, in a way, in this phase that I'm in now for my own life, and, when I had this very powerful experience with mushrooms back in '89, a few years after I'd started really speaking out and becoming public. And it was a kind of clarifying for me that what my mission was to be in life. And it wasn't just about changing public attitudes and laws around drugs and drug policy. It was also understanding that teaching people about psychoactive drugs and the need to think about them in broader and more science-based and more open-hearted ways, and about drug policies and the people who were involved in drugs, and not just in consuming them, but in growing them and using them and selling them and buying them, that was not just about drugs. It was also about it was a vehicle for speaking to broader values in our society. Right? That if we could come up and persuade people from across the political spectrum, from left to right, from libertarian to socialist, conservative, Republican, Democrat, whatever, to come together and see common ground here, if we could persuade people who came from across what I would call the drug use spectrum, from people who, love their marijuana and their psychedelics and had profound experience with them, to people who had suffered the worst possible traumas from the misuse of drugs by themselves or people they loved. If we could bring those people together on a common understanding of the need for drug policy reform, if we could bring together people from across the drug law spectrum, from people who had spent 20 years behind bars incarcerated on a nonviolent drug offense, together with people who had spent 20 years enforcing these drug laws and had now come to realize that maybe what they were doing had not been the right approach, and that those could become allies, that we were creating something new, something special, right? And that if we think about where this country needs to be headed, where this world needs to be headed, it was that bringing together, right? It's that thing that feels like it's crumbling now, right? I mean, with this profound polarization, I thought, the description of Trump before was perfectly accurate. I mean, this, incredible sociopath, this infantile narcissist, this person who could well destroy this country and this world, right? And that horrific thing. But at the same time, my own feeling that within the progressive community, the rigidity and the ideologically and the intolerance on our own side, and the inability to engage in the serious debates in ways that seems like it's essentially ceding power to people on the right, this is a terrible moment. And not just in America, but look around Europe, look around Asia, look around Latin America. It seems that basic idea of what it takes to bring people together again. Somebody once asked me, I was on Nightline one time, and he said, so you're just advocating for a kinder, gentler drug policy? And my response was, no, I'm advocating for a drug policy grounded in Menschkeit. Those of you who don't know what Menschkeit is, it's the Yiddish word, refers to a mensch. A mensch means a good human being. And Menschkeit is about bringing both your open heart and your brain to dealing with the tough challenges in life. But that's essentially what we're talking about. So now when I come to this and I think, so what does that mean for what's up here? Well, we know, look, we're focusing on psychedelics here, and it starts off psychedelics and end of life. And why do we focus on end of life? In part, well, for two reasons. Because as with medical marijuana, why do we focus on medical marijuana and people with MS and terminal illness? Because we believed two things were true. Right? I mean, there were some people who supported medical marijuana just as a stepping stone to legalization, others who were just medical marijuana purists and hated the association with legalization. But for I and the other key players, it was because of two things. The first was the belief that if anybody should have the legal right to obtain and consume marijuana, the ones who were most entitled to be first in line were the people who really needed it as a medicine. So that they had a moral right to be first in line. And the second was the belief, grounded in some evidence, but not conclusive, that opening up the dialogue around medical marijuana would help to transform the broader conversation around marijuana in our culture and ultimately lead, we hoped, to a broader debate and change in policy around legalizing and responsibly regulating cannabis. And in fact, it has, in retrospect, turned out to be that way. Right? Well, it's very much the same thing, obviously. We start with end of life, the people are terminally ill. How can people object to people who are terminally ill getting their medical marijuana or getting their psychedelics, right? We know that our moral case is strongest, their moral obligation to those people is strongest, right? And we know that the people who are opposed will be most willing to be sympathetic to that. Right? We then know when we start speaking about palliative care more broadly, that not referring just to those who are close to death, but those who are going through pain and suffering, and where palliative care is not about alleviating the fear of death, but about addressing other emotional, spiritual traumas, that of course those people also in a way have to have some opportunity, analogous once again to medical marijuana. We saw that in terms of the advocacy around this, there's always the strategies that are key. I mean, what Rick Doblin and MAPS are doing in terms of what he was describing before, you know, how Rick throws himself into this even before, he goes back even further stuff than I do. I mean, he goes back almost 40 years on this stuff, right? You know, going to Kennedy School, get a PhD about how the FDA works so he can then move, I mean, brilliant strategies, nitty gritty, raising the money, building an organization, understanding the system, doing it without abandoning your principles is an absolutely fundamental part. In the same way that what we had to do with medical marijuana, but also with sentencing reform, but also with, you know, needle exchange and access to sterile syringes and naloxone access and all these things, was dig down and do the nitty-gritty of the legislative work and understanding how to write the laws and do those things. There's no substitute for that, right? No substitute. But we also know that it also means that you can do sometimes this stuff. It's like with medical marijuana, people are asking about ballot initiatives. Well, you can't do a ballot initiative to educate the public. You can only do that if you got oodles of money. You know, if you're an alcohol company or some consumer good company or an oil company, you can spend $50 million on an initiative and you can move public opinion by 50 points, you know, and persuade most of the people to do the wrong thing in that short spectrum of time, right? But when you only have a few $million like us drug policy reformers do, you don't have that option. You gotta wait till, and when we did medical marijuana in California and then Washington State in 96, 98, public opinion was already approaching 60%. But you also need to do the work that helps to move the public. And what is that stuff? And by the way, not just with ballot initiatives, because if there's ever going to be a ballot initiative, we did a poll after we won the marijuana legalization last year in California to see if there was any opening. This is a private poll, I can reveal this piece, whether there was any support for legalizing marijuana, for mushrooms. I think we barely broke 25%. I mean, it was as low as support for legalizing marijuana was back in the mid-1980s, right? So there's no room to do an initiative now. And similarly with litigation strategies, if you really want to have the breakthroughs, right, like we've had in other issues like gay rights or civil rights, you know, the way that that happens is through the transformation of public opinion first, right? The Supreme Court's not going to move and read into the First Amendment or Fourth Amendment of our Constitution the sorts of principles around cognitive liberty that we believe should be there, as Ken was just suggesting, until public opinion is already there, right? They're not going to jump that far ahead, right? So we need to move the public. Well, now what does that mean? And how does one do that? Well, part of that, I mean, it's also the research. The research is pivotal. It's why with the folks at the Hefter Institute, I admire so deeply the research, the very hard, strong research that those guys are doing. And then when the same guys at Hefter develop this almost cult-like aversion to anything doing with advocacy or drug policy reform, you know, where they practically choose to boycott a gathering like this and to almost be actively hostile, I mean, I look at them, I think they're crazy. I think it's unpleasant, but it doesn't take away from my admiration of the important research work that they're doing. And it means that one way or another, we still find ways to work together, even if we're not actually working together arm in arm, because we're moving towards similar objectives. It means on the media front, I mean, when Rick Doblin's getting written up about his stuff, not just in the Washington Post, but in Breitbart News, Breitbart is writing a favorable piece about, you know, what MDMA or something that MAPS is up to, that's important, right? Constantly getting that out, getting the right people out there, getting the doctors, the patients, all of that. But at the same time, the entertainment media. I sometimes think that nothing is more important than the entertainment media. When we won medical marijuana in 1996 in California, you know, one thing I noticed, and then the other initiatives here and elsewhere a few years later, virtually every entertainment TV show in the late 1990s, both the comedies and the dramas, landed up weaving medical marijuana into one or more episodes, either for laughs or for tears. And you saw it happening in major motion pictures as well. I sometimes think when people ask me, how do we get this issue moving in Latin America? I say, take your most popular telenovela, your soap opera, and take your most beloved character, your grandmama, your grandtia, and have her get cancer. And have her go through a thing of refusing and refusing and refusing and refusing to take the medical marijuana for her symptoms until she finally accedes to the urgings of her doctor or her children or her grandchildren and do it. And that will change public opinion, right? I remember the movie Traffic with Michael Douglas, right? And how effectively, that came out I think in 2000, it demolished, it sort of critiqued the utter futility of the drug war, even as it fell short about talking about the negative consequences of the drug war. So the role of entertainment media is going to be absolutely absolutely central in this stuff. I'm looking forward to when Michael Pollan's book comes out. I mean, Michael Pollan, with a readership of millions or tens of millions for his writing on gardening and food, and Omnivore's Dilemma and all that, and the fact that he's going to have a book coming out on this very subject that we're addressing today, I think is going to help shake this thing up and reach ears that have not been reached so far today. Now, finally, you know, when we talk about the issues around race, well, we've been dealing with that as Drug Policy Alliance for 2 decades. Because we know in good part that the war on drugs so overwhelmingly and disproportionately affects people of color. You know, I've taken great pride in our biennial DPA conferences in having things where you have people coming out of the psychedelics field being exposed and engaged to all the issues around racism and the drug war, and around cannabis issues, and around harm reduction issues and all that, and at the same time, seeing people who come to our gatherings because they're focused on racial justice and the racial injustice of the drug war, and having their eyes and their hearts open when we put somebody up on a plenary session talking about the role that taking MDMA did in helping them address their teenage daughters approaching death from cancer and bringing that family together. And it's understanding not just how we deal with the evil, the harms and the terrors of drugs, but it's also the positive elements of drugs. It's understanding it's not about the drug per se, but about our broader relationship to this substance. It's about bringing these communities together. It's about the constant, incredibly frustrating reaching out. And so often with communities of color and African Americans just going, that's not us, that's white, that's this, that's that. But unless there's the systematic reaching out, we're not going to succeed in helping to open up this issue so much more broadly. You know, and the fact is, engaging elites, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, a guy named Michael Hollingshead made it his mission to go out there and just dose with LSD or mescaline or something dozens, if not hundreds, of famous people around the world, right? It was a way of engaging them. We know when Justice Kennedy decided to be the right vote in terms of basically coming out for the legalization of marriage equality, gay marriage, because his life was now engaged with people who were gay and he had to see that. The element of the personal, finding the ways in which people of great power, whether they are corporate titans, leading intellectuals, U.S. senators, Supreme Court justices, get to see this with their own eyes, the way you plant those seeds and engage the elites so that they can own this, because one powerful chairman of a Senate committee who understands everything that's being talked about today, ultimately, is going to be one of the major ways in which we break through. And then just to conclude, in this moment of this devastating crisis around overdose and opioids, this sort of perfect storm of the pharmaceuticals and heroin and fentanyl and carfentanil all coming together to kill people at a rate that exceeds the rate of AIDS deaths at the peak of the epidemic, that exceeds automobile deaths, that exceeds gun homicides. I mean, just astronomical things. We're looking at the role, and more writing is happening of the role that marijuana can play as an alternative to opioids for certain types of pain, and sometimes as a supplement to opioids in order to reduce the amount that needs to be given. But there's also this other issue, not just of psychedelic specific value, but I'm one who believes that at the heart of the opioid epidemic, which is almost uniquely American and exists in a few other countries, but nothing the way that other epidemics do, is not just that Americans are suffering a lot of physical pain for which they believe that opioids might be helpful and which they feel hopeful at the first, but it's also that we're experiencing this profound psychological and spiritual and existential pain. That's what's driving it. It's what's driving all these people of limited understanding to vote for the nightmare in the White House, right? It's that sort of pain. And the fact of the matter is, and of course opiates, it turns out, aren't very effective for dealing with that pain. They're sort of a Band-Aid that one puts on at the beginning, but then they turn on you and can destroy you in this way. And the fact is, the medicines we're talking about here, the plant medicines and even the synthetic medicines, the psychedelics, they are that way, we know, of addressing those pains, not just the physical, but the psychological and the spiritual and the existential. There's a connection there. And in the same way that more and more we're reading about the role that marijuana can play, psychedelics have this pivotal breakthrough possibility. And I think that's really our mission here and in this kind of intersection of movements coming around here. You know, the crisis we're in here in this country and manifesting in other ways in other countries is about this pain and it is about this fear. And these things can help do that. we're offering something special. Not risk-free, but something remarkably special. And we have to not forget that. Thanks.